They say an alpha without his wolf is worse than dead. I'm about to show you what happens when a kingdom throws away its future because they couldn't see past their own goddamn pride. This is the story of a prince who lost everything in one night, his birthright, his father's love, even his name, and became something the world had never seen before. Something darker, something unstoppable. Stick with me until the end of this journey, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments so I know where my tribe is watching from. Because what you're about to witness, it's going to shatter every belief you ever had about what makes someone truly powerful. The throne room stank of blood and ceremony. Lucian Nightvale stood at the center of the great hall, with his hands clenched so tight his nails cut half moons into his palms. Around him, 200 witnesses packed the stone chamber. Alphas from rival clans with their scarred faces and predator eyes, nobles draped in furs that cost more than a farmer's lifetime, warriors whose reputations were built on the corpses they'd left behind. Every single one of them had come to watch the prince awaken his wolf. The torches flickered against walls carved with the history of the Voltaire bloodline. 50 generations of Alpha Kings stared down from those engravings, their wolf spirits frozen in stone mid-howl. Lucien had memorized every face since childhood. His father told him those wolves were watching, judging, waiting to see if he was worthy of joining their legacy. Tonight would prove whether the boy carried greatness in his blood or if 17 years of training had been a spectacular waste of time. Ragnar Voltaire sat on the obsidian throne like violence given human form. The Alpha King stood 6.5 feet tall with shoulders that could break a man's spine and eyes that burned amber even in human skin. Scars decorated his forearms, trophies from challenges he'd ended with his bare hands. His wolf, Fenrir, lived so close to the surface that you could see it moving beneath his skin sometimes, a shadow beast pacing inside a cage of flesh. Next to him, Queen Evelyn looked like moonlight trying to survive a hurricane. Where Ragnar was all brutal edges, she was soft curves and quiet strength. Her hand rested on the arm of her throne, fingers white-knuckled against the stone. She'd barely slept for 3 days. Lucien could see the exhaustion carved into the fine lines around her eyes. She caught his gaze across the room and gave him the smallest nod. "You can do this. I believe in you." Lucien wanted to believe her so badly his chest ached with it. Elder Morvain stepped forward, his ritual staff clicking against the floor. The old wolf was ancient enough to remember when Ragnar's grandfather ruled, back when the Northern Empire was half its current size. His face looked like leather left in the sun too long, but his eyes were sharp as fresh-forged blades. Elder Morvain, Lucien thought, why do you look at me like you already know how this ends? The elder raised both arms and the crowd fell silent. Even the torches seemed to burn quieter. Your bloodline has ruled for 50 generations, Morvain said, his voice somehow filling every corner of the massive hall. Every king before you awakened their wolf spirit on the night of their 17th year. Tonight, we call upon the ancient power that flows through Voltaire blood. Tonight, Prince Lucien Nightvale will take his place among the wolves, or he will prove himself unworthy of the throne. The word unworthy hung in the air like poison. Lucien felt his father's stare burning into the side of his face. Don't look at him. Don't give him the satisfaction of seeing your fear. 2 priestesses approached carrying a silver bowl filled with liquid that glowed faint blue in the torchlight. They'd spent 3 days brewing it. Wolfsbane, mountain ash, the blood of the last enemy Alpha Ragnar had killed in single combat. The awakening draft. Every prince before him had drunk it and felt their wolf tear free from wherever the spirit world kept them locked away. Lucien took the bowl with steady hands, even though his heart was trying to punch through his ribcage. The liquid tasted like drinking liquid moonlight mixed with ground glass. He swallowed it in 3 gulps and handed the bowl back before his body could reject it. Heat exploded in his stomach, spreading through his veins like wildfire. His vision blurred. The room tilted sideways, and suddenly he was on his hands and knees without remembering how he got there. This was it. This was the moment. His bones should be breaking right now, rearranging themselves to make room for something bigger, something ancient and powerful that would prove to everyone in this room that he was his father's son. The pain should be unbearable and beautiful all at once, but there was nothing. Just heat fading and silence stretching, and 200 people watching him kneel there like a dog, waiting for a master who was never coming. Lucian pushed himself back to his feet. His legs shook. Sweat dripped down his spine. Give it time, he thought desperately. Sometimes it takes a minute. Sometimes the wolf is testing you, making sure you're strong enough to carry it. But he knew. Somewhere deep in the part of himself he didn't want to acknowledge, he already knew. Elder Morvain stepped closer, peering at Lucian like he was examining a piece of meat that had started to rot. The old wolf's nostrils flared. He was scenting for the change, for the new predator musk that should be rolling off the prince in waves. Nothing. Morvain's face went carefully blank. Impossible, he muttered. The Voltaire bloodline has never failed. Not once in 50 generations. Lucian could feel his father rising from the throne. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Try again, Ragnar said. His voice carried the kind of quiet that came before an execution. Give him another draft. My king, Morvain said carefully, the ritual only works once. If we force it, we could kill the boy. I said try again. The priestesses looked at each other. One of them was crying silently. They mixed another bowl with trembling hands. Lucian drank it. The heat came back, worse this time, like his insides were being slow cooked from the inside out. He kept his feet this time, but it didn't matter. Nothing was happening. Nothing was changing. He was just a 17-year-old boy standing in front of 200 witnesses while his father's empire watched him fail. In the crowd, someone laughed. Just once, quickly cut off, but Lucian heard it. The sound cut deeper than any blade. Alpha Constantine from the Eastern clan stepped forward from the crowd. He was a massive wolf with a reputation for crushing smaller packs and absorbing their territory. Scars covered half his face from a challenge fight he'd barely survived. Constantine grinned with too many teeth. Well, Ragnar, looks like the great Voltaire bloodline finally produced a dud. How does it feel knowing your only son is wolfless? How does it feel knowing your legacy ends with this pathetic whelp? Lucian felt rather than saw his father move. Ragnar crossed the space between the throne and Constantine in 3 strides and grabbed the Eastern Alpha by the throat. Fenrir blazed in Ragnar's eyes, 2 amber suns filled with murder. Watch your tongue before I rip it out and feed it to you. Constantine didn't flinch. Even with Ragnar's hand crushing his windpipe, he kept that ugly grin plastered across his face. Truth hurts, doesn't it? Your son is broken, defective. He's got no more right to that throne than the servant scrubbing your floors. Ragnar threw him backward. Constantine crashed into 3 nobles and they all went down in a tangle of limbs and expensive furs. The Alpha King turned to face his son, and Lucian saw something in his father's eyes he'd never seen before. Not anger. Not disappointment. Something colder. Something worse. Shame. You had one job, Ragnar said quietly, one single purpose since the day you were born, to awaken your wolf and prove you were worthy of this throne. And you failed. Father, I don't understand what happened. You don't understand? You don't understand? Ragnar's voice cracked like a whip. I gave you the best trainers in the Empire, the finest weapons masters. I spent 17 years preparing you for this moment, and you stand there telling me you don't understand why you're defective? Lucian felt his mother rise from her throne. Ragnar, please. He's still your son. He still carries your blood. He carries nothing, Ragnar roared. Look at him, Eveline. Look at what we created. A wolfless embarrassment who just humiliated us in front of every rival clan in the north. They're going to go back to their territories and spread the word that the Voltaire line is weak, that we're finished. The king's voice dropped to something quiet and vicious. Because of him. Lucian wanted to defend himself, wanted to explain that he'd trained harder than anyone, that he'd followed every ritual and every rule, that he'd done everything right. But the words died in his throat because what difference did it make? The result was the same. He was broken. Wrong. A mistake written in flesh and bone. Ragnar turned to address the crowd. From this moment forward, this boy is no longer my son. He is no longer a prince of the Voltaire Empire. He is nothing. Mother, Lucian heard himself say. His voice sounded like a stranger's. Eveline's face crumpled, but Ragnar grabbed her arm before she could move. She stays, he snarled. You go. Where? Lucian asked. The question came out smaller than he meant it to. Ragnar smiled, but there was no warmth in it, no mercy. The wastelands beyond the northern border, where all the broken things go to die. If you somehow survive, consider it proof the gods have a sense of humor. You can't be serious, someone in the crowd muttered. But Ragnar was deadly serious. The guards were already moving, forming a perimeter around Lucien like he was a prisoner instead of a prince, like he was something dangerous that needed to be removed before it contaminated the bloodline further. Strip him, Ragnar ordered. He goes into the wastelands with nothing, no weapons, no provisions. Let him learn what it means to be truly powerless. The guards moved fast and efficient. They tore the ceremonial robes off Lucien's back, removed his boots, took the silver ring his mother had given him on his 16th birthday. Within 30 seconds, he was standing there in just his underlinen pants, shivering in the cold air. "Mother," he tried again. Evelyn lunged forward, but Ragnar held her back with one massive arm. She was sobbing openly now, not caring who saw. "Please," she begged. "Please don't do this. He's our son, our only child." "We don't have a son anymore," Ragnar said flatly. "We have a mistake that needs correcting." The guards grabbed Lucien by both arms. He didn't fight them. What was the point? His wolf was supposed to be the thing that made him strong, that gave him the power to defend himself and lead armies and inspire fear in his enemies. Without it, he was just meat waiting to be torn apart. They dragged him toward the massive doors at the end of the throne room. Lucien twisted his head around, desperate for one last look at his mother. Evelyn was still fighting against Ragnar's grip, her face streaked with tears. Their eyes met across the distance. "Survive," she mouthed. "Please survive." Then the doors slammed shut, and Lucien was in the corridor with 6 guards, and the rest of his miserable life stretching ahead of him like a road that only led to darkness. They marched him through the palace in silence. Servants pressed themselves against the walls as the group passed, their faces carefully blank. News traveled fast in the palace. Everyone already knew. The prince was broken. The bloodline was tainted. The mighty Voltaire Empire had produced a defective heir, and now they were watching him get taken out with the trash. Lucien kept his head up, even though every step felt like walking toward his own execution. Pride was all he had left. Pride and the rapidly fading memory of his mother's voice telling him to survive. They emerged into the courtyard where the night air hit him like a physical blow. It was deep winter in the north, the kind of cold that could kill an unprepared man in hours. Stars scattered across the sky like broken glass. The moon hung fat and full above the palace, illuminating everything in silver light. "Perfect night for a hunt," one of the guards muttered. "Shame the prey is so pathetic." Another one laughed. "How long you think he lasts out there? I give him 3 hours before something finds him." "Nah," the first guard said. 2 hours maximum. Kid's never been outside the palace walls without an army protecting him. He's dead meat." Lucien bit down on the inside of his cheek hard enough to taste copper. "Don't give them the satisfaction. Don't let them see you break." They walked for 30 minutes through increasingly rough terrain. The palace lights fell away behind them, until there was nothing but wilderness and the distant howls of actual wolves echoing through the trees. Not alphas, just regular animals looking for their next meal. Finally, they reached the border. A massive stone marker half buried in frozen ground marked where the empire ended and the wastelands began. Beyond that marker, the trees grew twisted and wrong. The shadows moved in ways that made your hindbrain scream danger. This was cursed land, the place where the empire dumped its criminals and its mistakes and anything else it wanted to forget. "This is where you get off," the lead guard said. He shoved Lucien forward hard enough that the prince stumbled and nearly fell. Lucien caught himself on the marker stone. The cold bit into his bare feet. He was already shaking, and they'd barely even left him yet. "Any last words, Princeling?" Lucien straightened and turned to face them. 6 trained warriors in full armor, staring at a barefoot 17-year-old in his underwear. He should have been terrified, should have been begging for mercy or trying to bargain his way out of this nightmare. Instead, he heard himself say, "Yeah, I got last words." The guards waited, probably expecting him to plead or apologize or break down crying like they wanted. Lucien smiled. It felt wrong on his face, like his mouth didn't remember how. "When I come back," he said quietly, "and you see what I've become, remember that you stood here and laughed." The guards looked at each other. Then they burst out laughing hard enough that a couple of them had to wipe tears from their eyes. "When you come back," the lead guard wheezed. "That's good. That's really good. Hey boys, the wolfless prince thinks he's coming back." They were still laughing as they turned and headed back toward the palace, their torchlight growing smaller and smaller until it finally disappeared completely. Lucien stood alone at the border of the wastelands with nothing but the clothes on his back and the cold slowly eating him alive. He looked up at the moon. It stared back, indifferent and ancient. Somewhere in the darkness, something howled. Not a wolf. Something worse. Lucien took one breath, then another. His body was already going numb around the edges, but his mind felt strangely clear. This was it. This was the moment where he either laid down and died like his father expected, or he walked into that nightmare forest and found out if he had any fight left in him. He thought about his mother's face as they dragged him away. Survive. Lucien stepped across the border into the wastelands. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees the moment he crossed. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath his feet was frozen solid and sharp enough to cut, but he kept walking because stopping meant dying, and he wasn't ready for that yet. He made it maybe 20 minutes before his legs gave out. Lucien collapsed against a tree trunk, his breath coming in short gasps that created tiny clouds in the freezing air. His feet were bleeding, his hands were numb. The cold was burrowing into his bones like a living thing, shutting down his body piece by piece. This is how it ends, he thought distantly. Not in glory, not in battle. Just a broken prince freezing to death in the dark because he failed the one test that mattered. His eyes drifted closed. That's when he heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, something moving through the forest with purpose. Lucien forced his eyes open. A figure materialized from the shadows about 30 feet away, wrapped in a cloak so black it seemed to absorb the moonlight. The figure moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in this nightmare landscape. "Well," a voice said, "what do we have here?" The stranger stepped closer, and Lucien got his first clear look at the man's face. Sharp features, silver hair despite looking maybe 40 years old, eyes that gleamed violet in the darkness, a color that shouldn't exist in human irises. "A prince," the stranger continued, "left to die in the cursed lands." "How very predictable. Your father always did have a flair for the dramatic." "How do you know about my father?" Lucien's voice came out as a croak. The stranger smiled. It wasn't a friendly expression. "I know a great many things, boy. I know why your wolf never came. I know what you really are. And I know that right now you have exactly two choices." He crouched down so his face was level with Lucien's. "Choice 1. You lie here and freeze to death like a good little failure, giving your father exactly what he wanted. Choice 2. You come with me, and I teach you how to become something infinitely more dangerous than any wolf could ever be." Lucien stared at this impossible stranger with his impossible eyes. "What are you?" The man's smile widened. "My name is Valor Draven, and I'm the sorcerer your empire tried to execute 20 years ago for mastering the kind of magic they fear more than death itself." He extended one hand. "The choice is yours, Lucien Nightvale. Die here as a discarded prince, or live long enough to burn that throne room to ashes and scatter your father's empire to the wind." Lucien looked at that offered hand. Every logical part of his brain screamed that this was obviously a trap, that sorcerers were exactly the kind of monsters his father had warned him about, that going with this man meant walking an even darker path than the one he was already on. But dying accomplished nothing. Dying meant his father won. Dying meant that Smugguard's prediction came true, and 17 years of his life amounted to exactly nothing. Lucien reached up and grabbed Valor's hand. The sorcerer's grip was freezing cold and iron strong. He hauled Lucien to his feet like the prince weighed nothing. "Good," Valor said. "Let's get you somewhere warm before you lose any fingers. We have so much work to do." He turned and started walking deeper into the wastelands. Lucien stumbled after him, his body screaming in protest, but his mind suddenly, terrifyingly awake. "One question," Lucien called after him. His voice was getting stronger now that hope had lit something inside his chest. "Why are you helping me?" Valor glanced back over his shoulder. His violet eyes blazed with something that might have been amusement, or might have been hunger, or might have been both. "Because," the sorcerer said, "I've spent 20 years waiting for someone like you. Someone with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Someone broken enough to be remade. And when I'm done teaching you what real power looks like, you're going to walk back into that palace and show your father exactly what he threw away. They walked for what felt like hours through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate in the dark. But Vialor moved like he could see perfectly, never stumbling, never hesitating. Lucien followed in his wake, his body running on fumes and spite. Finally, they reached a clearing where a small cabin stood. Light glowed warm and golden through the windows. Smoke curled from the chimney. It looked completely, absurdly normal in the middle of this cursed forest. Vialor pushed open the door and heat rolled out like a physical wave. Lucien practically fell through the doorway, his frozen body immediately beginning to thaw in painful pins and needles. "Sit," Vialor ordered, pointing at a chair near the fireplace. "Drink this." He pressed a wooden cup into Lucien's shaking hands. The liquid inside was dark and steaming and smelled like herbs the prince didn't recognize. Lucien drank without asking what it was. At this point, poison would be a mercy. The warmth spread through his body faster than it should have. Within minutes, the numbness in his extremities was fading. The bleeding from his cut feet slowed and stopped. He looked up at Vialor with wide eyes. "What was that?" "Healing draft," Vialor said casually. He'd removed his cloak and was moving around the cabin with easy familiarity. "Can't have you dying on me before we even start the interesting part." "What interesting part?" Vialor turned to face him, and suddenly the friendly act dropped away. What replaced it was something ancient and dangerous and completely inhuman. "The part where I teach you shadow magic," the sorcerer said. "The most forbidden, most powerful form of sorcery ever discovered. The kind that lets you control darkness itself, manipulate reality, break minds, shatter armies. The kind your father tried to exterminate because it terrifies every alpha in existence." "Why would it terrify them?" "Because shadow magic doesn't care about bloodlines," Vialor said. "It doesn't care if you were born with a wolf or not. It cares about will, about hunger, about your capacity to embrace the darkness inside yourself and turn it into a weapon. And you, Lucien Nightvale, are going to be exceptional at it." "How do you know?" Vialor crossed the room and placed one cold hand against Lucien's chest, right over his heart. The prince felt something stir inside him, something that had been sleeping his entire life. "Because I can feel it in you," the sorcerer whispered. "That emptiness where your wolf should be? That's not a defect, that's a void. And voids are hungry. We're going to feed yours until it becomes powerful enough to swallow your father's empire whole." Lucien stared at him. "How long will it take?" Vialor smiled that dangerous smile. "Years. Maybe decades. This isn't something you learn in a few months. Shadow magic requires complete transformation, mind, body, and soul. It will break you down and rebuild you into something new, something dark. By the time I'm finished, you'll barely recognize yourself. Will I be powerful enough to go back? To face my father? You'll be powerful enough to reduce that palace to rubble if you want. But..." Vialor's grip tightened. Power comes with a price. The darkness you learn to control will also try to control you. It will whisper in your ear and show you things that will haunt your sleep and tempt you toward choices that can never be undone. You have to be strong enough to use it without becoming a monster. "Maybe I want to be a monster," Lucien said quietly. "Maybe that's exactly what my father deserves." Vialor studied him for a long moment. "Then you'll fit right in. But remember, there's a difference between controlled violence and mindless destruction. One makes you powerful, the other makes you a rabid dog that needs to be put down." He released Lucien and stepped back. "Rest tonight. Heal. Tomorrow we start your real education." "And Lucien? The training will be harder than anything you've ever experienced. You'll beg me to stop. You'll curse the day you took my hand. But if you survive it, you'll become something your father can't even comprehend." Lucien nodded. He was exhausted down to his bones, but for the first time since the awakening ceremony, he felt something other than despair burning in his chest. Hope. Rage. Purpose. Whatever this path looked like, it had to be better than dying forgotten in the cold. Vialor showed him to a small bedroom in the back of the cabin. The bed was simple but clean. Lucien collapsed onto it and was asleep before his head hit the pillow. His dreams were dark and full of shadows that moved with their own intelligence, wrapping around him like living things. But for once, He wasn't afraid of the darkness. For once, it felt like coming home. 20 years later, a figure in black armor stood on the hill overlooking the capital city of the Voltaire Empire. Lucien Nightvale watched smoke rise from the distant palace walls and felt absolutely nothing. The invading army had hit the capital 3 hours ago. 5,000 warriors from the southern clans finally unified enough to challenge Ragnar's weakening grip on power. They'd breached the outer walls within the first hour. Now they were slaughtering their way toward the throne room. He should feel something: concern for his mother, satisfaction at his father's downfall, horror at the carnage spreading through the streets. Instead, there was just the familiar cold emptiness where emotions used to live. 20 years of training had carved most of the softness out of him. Valor had been right about that. Shadow magic didn't just teach you to control darkness, it made you part of it. The sorcerer appeared beside him without making a sound. Even after 2 decades, Valor looked exactly the same. Silver hair, violet eyes, that ageless face. "Your mother's message arrived an hour ago," Valor said. "The traitors inside the palace have made their move. If you're going to act, it needs to be now." Lucien continued watching the distant chaos. "Why should I care if my father's empire burns?" "Because you're not doing this for him. You're doing it for her. For the queen who begged you to survive. For the mother who never stopped loving you even when the empire called you worthless." Lucien's jaw tightened. That was the problem with Valor. The old sorcerer understood him too well, knew exactly which buttons to push. "I could let them all die," Lucien said. "Walk away and build something new somewhere else." "You could," Valor agreed, "but you won't. Because you've spent 20 years imagining the moment you walk back through those doors. The moment your father sees what you've become. The moment those nobles who laughed at you realize they made a catastrophic mistake." A smile touched Lucien's lips. It was not a kind expression. "You know me too well. I know you're about to do something dramatic and probably excessive. Try to keep collateral damage to a minimum. Massacring innocent civilians is bad form." "Noted." Valor placed one hand on Lucien's shoulder. The gesture was almost fatherly, though the sorcerer would never admit it. "Remember what I taught you. Power is a tool. Keep control and you're a weapon. Lose control and you're just another monster." Lucien nodded once. Then he stepped off the hill and the shadows wrapped around him like old friends. By the time he reached the base of the hill, he'd vanished completely into the darkness. The capital gates hung broken and bloody. Bodies littered the courtyard, palace guards who'd made their stand and lost. The invaders were everywhere, their war cries echoing off stone walls as they surged toward the palace proper. None of them noticed the shadow moving between them. Lucien walked through the chaos like a ghost, darkness bending around him in ways that made eyes slide past without registering his presence. He'd gotten very good at this particular trick. When you could manipulate shadow itself, invisibility was child's play. He reached the palace steps and paused. The massive doors hung open, torn from their hinges. Inside, he could hear screaming and the clash of steel on steel. The final defenders were making their stand in the throne room. This was it. 20 years of exile, 20 years of training and transformation and becoming something that would have terrified his 17-year-old self. Lucien climbed the steps and walked into his father's palace for the first time in 2 decades. The interior was exactly as he remembered. Same stone corridors, same tapestries, same vaulted ceilings. But now it was decorated with fresh corpses. Servants who'd gotten caught in the crossfire. Guards who'd fought to the last breath. The invaders had almost reached the throne room. Lucien could feel the battle raging just ahead, could taste the fear and violence saturating the air. He rounded the final corner and stopped. The throne room doors stood open. Inside, Alpha Ragnar Voltaire fought like the legend he was, his massive wolf Fenrir fully manifested as they tore through enemy after enemy. The king was covered in blood, most of it not his own, but he was tiring. Age and time had weakened even the mighty Alpha King. Around him, the last of the palace guard formed a desperate perimeter, maybe 30 warriors left out of what had been 300. Queen Evelyn stood behind them, her face pale but composed. She held a dagger in one hand. If the guards fell, she'd at least go down fighting. The invading force numbered in the hundreds. They poured through the doors like a living tide, convinced victory was moments away. None of them saw the shadows in the corner begin to move. Lucien stepped out of the darkness and into the torchlight. For a heartbeat, nobody noticed. They were too focused on the battle, on the clash of blades and the screaming wounded and the blood making the floor slick. Then someone on the invading side pointed. "Who the hell is that?" The fighting stuttered. Warriors on both sides turned to stare at the figure in black armor standing at the edge of the carnage. Lucien had foregone a helmet. Let them see his face. Let them remember it. Ragnar's eyes went wide. His wolf flickered, uncertainty breaking his concentration. That face. He knew that face, but it was impossible. That boy had died 20 years ago in the wastelands. Everyone knew it. "Hello, father," Lucien said. His voice carried through the sudden silence. Not loud, but somehow reaching every corner of the massive chamber. The shadows around him moved wrong, writhing like living things. Queen Evelyn made a sound that might have been a sob or might have been a laugh. "Lucien," she whispered. One of the invading alphas, a scarred brute with lieutenant markings, laughed. "You're serious? You're the dead prince? The broken one with no wolf?" He pointed his blade at Lucien mockingly. "This is perfect. We get to kill the ghost and the king in one night." Lucien smiled. It was the expression of something wearing a human face. "You're welcome to try." The lieutenant charged with a roar. He was fast, alpha speed, the kind of movement that could tear a normal human apart before they could blink. Lucien didn't move. The shadows moved for him. They erupted from the floor like living spears wrapping around the charging alpha mid-stride. The lieutenant's war cry turned into a scream as the darkness lifted him off his feet and slammed him into the ceiling hard enough to crack stone. Then the shadows tore him in half. The throne room went absolutely silent, except for the wet sound of body parts hitting the floor. Lucien looked at the remaining invaders. His eyes had gone completely black. No whites, no iris, just pools of living shadow. "Now," he said quietly, "who else wants to die?" For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then the invading force broke and ran, trampling each other in their desperation to escape. The shadows chased them, wrapping around ankles and throats, pulling the slowest ones down into darkness that swallowed their screams. Within a minute, the throne room was clear except for the dead and the surviving palace guard. Lucien let the shadows recede. His eyes returned to their normal dark brown. He looked across the carnage to where his father stood frozen, still in his massive wolf form. Ragnar shifted back to human. He stood there covered in blood and staring at his son like he was seeing a nightmare made flesh. "That's impossible," the Alpha King rasped. "You died. You had no wolf. You were nothing." "I was never nothing," Lucien said. He started walking forward, his boots echoing on blood-slicked stone. "You just couldn't see past your own prejudice long enough to realize what I could become." "What are you?" "Something infinitely more dangerous than any wolf could ever be." Lucien stopped 10 feet away from his father. Up close, he could see how much Ragnar had aged. The once mighty king looked tired, worn down. The weight of holding an empire together had carved deep lines into his face. From the corner of his eye, Lucien saw his mother push through the guards. She walked toward him slowly, like he might vanish if she moved too quickly. "My son," Evelyn breathed. "You survived. You came back." Lucien's carefully maintained control cracked just slightly. "Mother." She reached out to touch his face, and he let her, even though it made something inside his chest hurt in ways shadow magic couldn't fix. Tears streamed down her face. "I never stopped looking," she whispered. 20 years, and I never stopped hoping you'd find your way home." "This isn't home," Lucien said gently. "This place stopped being home the night Father threw me away like garbage." Ragnar flinched. That was the moment. That was when Lucien saw his father's carefully maintained alpha mask crack, and something almost human show through. "I was wrong," Ragnar said. The words came out rough, like they were being torn from somewhere deep. "I was wrong about you, about what strength really means." "Wrong doesn't cover it," Lucien said. His voice went cold again. "You humiliated me in front of the entire empire. You stripped me naked and threw me into the wastelands to die, because I didn't manifest a wolf on command. You thought I was weak, that I was a mistake, that throwing me away would somehow protect your precious bloodline's reputation." Ragnar had no answer for that. Movement from the side of the room made Lucian's head snap around. A man in noble's clothing had been trying to edge toward the exit. He froze when Lucian's gaze locked onto him. "Cedric," Lucian said. "How unexpected to see you still alive." Cedric Thornhill had been his father's chief advisor for 30 years. He was a thin man with clever eyes and soft hands that had never held a weapon. Lucian remembered him clearly, the way Cedric used to watch him during training with barely concealed contempt. "Prince Lucian," Cedric said smoothly, "what a remarkable transformation. I'm sure your father is proud." "Save it," Lucian interrupted. "I know what you did." Cedric's expression went carefully blank. "I don't know what you mean." Lucian gestured and shadows wrapped around Cedric's ankles, rooting him in place. 20 years ago, you convinced my father that I would destroy the Empire if I ever took the throne, that I was cursed, that banishing me was the only way to save the bloodline." Cedric's face had gone very pale. "That's absurd. Why would I—" "Because you've been working with the southern clans for years," Lucian said, "planning this invasion, weakening my father's alliances. You needed me gone so there would be no clear heir when Ragnar finally fell, no rallying point for the loyal clans. He let the shadows tighten. You manipulated my father's fear and pride to get rid of the one person who might have stopped your treason before it started." Ragnar turned on his advisor with murder in his eyes. "Cedric? Tell me he's lying." But Cedric's expression had shifted. The smooth courtier mask had fallen away, replaced by cold calculation. "Congratulations," he said to Lucian. "You figured it out. Took you long enough." Then he moved faster than any human should be able to, drawing a poisoned blade from his sleeve and driving it toward Ragnar's exposed back. Lucian was faster. The shadows caught Cedric mid-lunge, wrapping around his arm and yanking him backward. The poisoned blade clattered to the floor. Cedric struggled, but the darkness held him as surely as iron chains. "That blade was meant for my father," Lucian said. He walked closer to the trapped traitor. "What's the poison? Something fast?" "Fast enough," Cedric snarled. "One scratch, and even your mighty Alpha King would have had minutes left. And with him gone, and you conveniently dead, the Empire would have fractured. The southern clans would have carved it up, and I would have been richly rewarded for my service." Lucian looked at the blade on the floor. Then he looked at his father. Ragnar stood frozen, only now realizing how close he'd come to death. "You should thank me," Cedric continued, his face twisted with hate. "That broken boy you threw away 20 years ago? He just saved your miserable life." "And you should beg," Lucian said quietly, "because I'm deciding right now whether to make your death quick or spend several hours discovering exactly how much pain shadow magic can inflict before the human body gives up." Cedric's sneer faltered. The shadows around him tightened until his bones creaked. But before Lucian could follow through, Ragnar stepped forward. "Wait," he said. Lucian raised an eyebrow. "You want to show him mercy?" "No," Ragnar said. "I want to make this right." The Alpha King crossed the distance to Cedric and grabbed him by the throat, lifting the traitor off the ground with one hand. "For 30 years you stood at my side," Ragnar growled. "I trusted you. I listened to your counsel. I let you convince me to throw away my own son." His grip tightened. Cedric's face was turning purple. "That ends now." There was a terrible crunching sound as Ragnar's hand crushed Cedric's windpipe. The traitor's eyes went wide and then glassy. His body went limp. Ragnar dropped the corpse like it was garbage. The throne room was silent except for the crackling torches and the ragged breathing of exhausted warriors. Ragnar turned to face Lucian. His face was carefully neutral, but his hands were shaking. "I can't take back what I did to you," he said. "I can't give you back those 20 years or undo the suffering I caused, but I can tell you the truth." He took a breath. "I was afraid. Not of you being weak, of you being different, of something I couldn't understand or control. Cedric knew that. He manipulated my fear and I let him because it was easier than admitting my own prejudice." The mighty Alpha King's voice cracked. "I failed you, Lucian, as a father and as a king. And if you want to watch this empire burn as revenge, I won't blame you." Lucian stared at the man who'd ruined his life. 20 years ago, this moment would have felt like victory, like vindication, like proof that he'd been worth something all along. But now it just felt empty. "I don't want your empire to burn," Lucian said finally. I want it to be better. I want it to be a place where broken boys aren't thrown away just because they're different. Ragnar nodded slowly. Then help me rebuild it. Help me fix what I broke. Before Lucien could answer, his mother collapsed. She went down hard, her legs simply giving out. Lucian crossed the distance in 3 strides and caught her before she hit the ground. Mother? Evelyn's breathing was labored. There was blood on her dress, fresh blood spreading from a wound he hadn't noticed before. She'd been hit during the battle and never said anything. Get a healer, Lucian roared. Now! But Evelyn grabbed his hand with surprising strength. No time, she whispered. It's deep. I can feel it. Don't you dare, Lucian said. His voice was shaking. 20 years of distance and darkness, and he couldn't watch her die right now. Not when he'd just gotten her back. Evelyn smiled. It was a peaceful expression. You came home, she said softly. My boy came home and saved us all. That's all I needed. Her eyes drifted closed and her breathing went shallow, and for the first time in 2 decades, Lucian felt the shadows inside him respond to emotion instead of command. They writhed around the throne room in response to his grief, darkening the torches, making everyone flinch back. No, he whispered. Please, no. But Queen Evelyn, the woman who'd loved him even when the entire empire called him worthless, stopped breathing. And in that moment, Lucian finally understood what Vailor had warned him about all those years ago. The darkness inside him didn't just respond to commands, it fed on emotion, on pain and rage and grief. And right now, it was hungry. The shadows exploded outward, swallowing half the throne room in darkness so complete it was like staring into the void between stars. Lucien stood at the center of it, holding his mother's body, and felt the last threads of his humanity threatening to snap. Father, he heard himself say. His voice came out distorted, layered with echoes that shouldn't exist. You need to run, right now. But Ragnar stood his ground, because for the first time in 20 years he was looking at his son, really looking, past the power and the shadows and the transformation, and seeing the broken 17-year-old boy underneath. I'm not running, Ragnar said quietly. Not from you. Never again. And that confession, that small moment of a father refusing to abandon his son, even when the darkness was consuming him, was enough. The shadows pulled back. Lucien got control. Barely. But enough. He looked down at his mother's peaceful face and made a decision. Carefully, gently, he handed her body to his father. Ragnar took her weight like it was the most precious thing in the world, and for the first time in Lucien's memory, he saw his father cry. I will rebuild this empire, Lucien said. His voice was hollow, cold. But I'm not doing it for you, I'm doing it for her, because she asked me to survive and I owe her everything. He turned and walked toward the throne. Every surviving person in the room drew back, giving him space. The shadows clung to him like a second skin. Lucien sat on the obsidian throne that had belonged to 50 generations of Alpha Kings. It felt wrong and right all at once. From this moment forward, he said, addressing the room, this empire changes. Bloodline purity ends. Wolf supremacy ends. Children born without wolves will be valued for what they can become, not thrown away for what they're not. His eyes swept across the surviving nobles and guards. Anyone who can't accept that can leave now. But if you stay, you serve a new kind of king, one who earned his power through pain instead of inheriting it through privilege. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just stared at the terrifying prince who'd returned from death wreathed in shadow magic. Lucien leaned back against the throne and let the darkness pool at his feet. Good, he said. Then let's begin. The night wore on. Healers came for the wounded. Servants cleaned the blood. The bodies were carried away. And through it all, Lucien sat on that throne and felt absolutely nothing. He'd come home. He'd saved his father's empire. He'd avenged 20 years of exile. But as dawn broke over the capital and light spilled through the throne room windows, he realized the truth Vailor had tried to warn him about. The boy who'd been thrown into the wastelands was truly dead. What sat on the throne now was something new, something powerful, something that could reshape an empire or burn it to ashes depending on which path it chose. And in the shadows at the edge of the room, Vailor Draven watched his creation with satisfaction. After 20 years, the weapon was finally ready. The only question remaining was what Lucien would do with all that terrible power. But that was a question for another day. Right now there was an empire to rebuild, and a mother to bury, and a future to forge from the ruins of everything that came before. Lucien Nightvale looked out at his father's broken kingdom and wondered if redemption was even possible for someone who'd become the darkness itself. The answer, he suspected, would determine whether he became the Empire's salvation or its destruction. The funeral happened 3 days later under a sky so gray it looked like the gods themselves were mourning. Lucien stood at the edge of the royal burial ground watching workers lower his mother's body into frozen earth. She'd been wrapped in white silk with winter roses covering the shroud. Tradition said the Alpha King should light the funeral pyre, but Ragnar had insisted on a burial instead. Something about wanting a place to visit, somewhere solid to remember her. Lucien thought it was weakness masquerading as sentiment, but he kept that opinion to himself. The gathered crowd numbered maybe 200, nobles who'd survived the invasion, high-ranking military officers, representatives from the loyal clans. They all kept their distance from Lucien like he carried a plague. Word had spread fast about what happened in the throne room, about the shadows and the power, and the way he'd torn through enemy forces like they were made of paper. Fear was its own kind of respect, Valor had told him once. People who fear you will obey even when love fails. Ragnar stood on the opposite side of the grave, his face carved from stone. He hadn't said more than 10 words to Lucien since Evelyn died. The Alpha King had aged a decade in 3 days. His shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. Grief was eating him from the inside out and taking the legendary warrior with it. Good, something dark whispered in Lucien's mind. Let him feel what it's like to lose everything. But that thought tasted sour even as it formed. His mother wouldn't have wanted this, wouldn't have wanted her death to drive a deeper wedge between father and son. The problem was Lucien didn't know how to bridge that gap anymore. 20 years of exile had carved too much distance, too much anger. The boy who desperately wanted his father's approval had died in the wastelands. What came back was something that didn't need anyone's validation. Elder Morvain stepped forward to speak the traditional words. The old wolf looked even more ancient than Lucien remembered, his skin papery thin, his hands shaking as he raised them skyward. He spoke about duty and sacrifice and the queen's unwavering loyalty to her people. Lucien stopped listening halfway through. Empty words from a man who'd stood silent 20 years ago when Ragnar threw away his only son. Morvain could rot for all he cared. The ceremony dragged on for another 30 minutes. When it finally ended, the crowd dispersed quickly. Nobody wanted to linger in the cold. Nobody wanted to risk drawing Lucien's attention. Except one person. A young woman approached from the cluster of nobles, her movements careful and deliberate. She looked maybe 25, with sharp features and dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her clothing marked her as minor nobility, expensive enough to show status, but practical enough for actual work. She stopped 10 feet away and bowed. "Your Majesty." Lucien raised an eyebrow. "I'm not king yet." "A technicality," she said. "Everyone knows it's only a matter of time." Bold words. "Who are you?" "Sarah Blackwood. I serve as the palace logistics coordinator. Food, supplies, staff management. The boring work that keeps everything running." "And you approached me because—" Sarah's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Because someone needs to tell you the truth about the situation you've inherited, and your father is too broken to do it himself." Lucien studied her. Most people couldn't hold his gaze for more than a few seconds before the shadows made them uncomfortable. Sarah stared back without flinching. "Speak," he said. "The Empire is dying," she said bluntly. "The invasion revealed how fragile everything has become. We've got 3 clans threatening secession, food shortages in the eastern provinces because last year's harvest failed, and our military is down to maybe 60% strength. On top of that, half the noble houses are bankrupt from funding your father's wars, and the other half are considering treason because they don't believe he can protect them anymore." She paused. "And now you've arrived with shadow magic and a reputation for tearing people in half. The nobles are terrified. The common people don't know what to believe. Everyone's waiting to see if you're here to save the Empire or burn it to ashes." Lucien felt something almost like amusement. "You always this direct?" "Only when the situation demands it. Sugarcoating problems doesn't make them disappear. It just means you don't see the knife until it's buried in your back." Fair point. So what did you suggest? Sarah glanced around to make sure nobody was in earshot. You need to make a choice fast. Either claim the throne immediately and start issuing orders, or step back and let your father try to hold things together. But you can't do this halfway. The Empire can't survive with two competing centers of power. My father's not ready to step down. Your father can barely get out of bed, Sarah said. I've seen him. He's not eating, barely sleeping. The grief is destroying him and everyone can see it. If you wait for him to officially abdicate, the whole thing will collapse first. Lucian looked across the graveyard to where Ragnar stood alone beside the fresh grave. The Alpha King's shoulders were shaking. He was crying again. Something twisted in Lucien's chest. Not quite pity. Not quite satisfaction. Just a complicated knot of emotions he didn't know how to untangle. I'll think about it, he said to Sarah. Don't think too long. We've got maybe 2 weeks before something breaks. Could be a clan revolt. Could be a food riot. Could be one of your father's loyal generals deciding a military coup is the only way to restore stability. She bowed again and walked away, leaving Lucian alone with his thoughts and the cold wind cutting through the graveyard. Valor materialized from the shadows near the gate. The sorcerer had stayed hidden during the ceremony, but Lucien had felt his presence the entire time. After 20 years, they were connected in ways that went beyond teacher and student. The girl makes good points, Valor said. Your window is closing. I know. So what's stopping you? This is what we trained for. What we spent 2 decades building toward. Lucian watched his father collapse to his knees beside the grave. Because taking the throne while he's like this feels like kicking a man who's already down. Since when do you care about fair fights? Since I realized I don't want to become the same kind of monster he was. Valor smiled. It wasn't a warm expression. Too late for that, boy. You crossed that line years ago. The question now is whether you're going to use your monstrosity for something productive or waste it on sentiment. Lucian didn't answer. He just turned and walked away from the graveyard, leaving both his mother and his broken father behind. The War Council convened that evening in the strategy room beneath the palace. Lucien attended even though nobody had officially invited him. He just walked in and took a seat at the table and waited to see if anyone would challenge his presence. Nobody did. The room held maybe 15 people, senior military commanders, heads of major noble houses, the few advisors who'd survived Cedric's purge. They all looked exhausted, scared, desperate for someone to tell them what came next. Ragnar sat at the head of the table, but he might as well have been a statue. He stared at the maps spread across the surface without really seeing them. His hands lay flat on the wood, completely still. General Kyle Stormbreak cleared his throat. He was a grizzled warrior in his 60s with more scars than smooth skin. A loyalist who'd served 3 Alpha Kings and survived more battles than most men could count. My king, we need to discuss the situation in the eastern provinces. The 3 clans there are demanding. It doesn't matter, Ragnar said quietly. Everyone at the table froze. My king? It doesn't matter, Ragnar repeated. His voice was completely flat. None of it matters anymore. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lord Heron Frostmane, head of one of the oldest noble houses, leaned forward. Your Majesty, with all respect, we need decisive action. The Empire is fragmenting. If we don't respond to these threats immediately, then let it fragment, Ragnar said. Let them secede. Let the whole thing burn. I don't care. You don't care? Lord Heron's face went red. You've spent your entire life building this empire and now you don't care? My wife is dead, Ragnar said. His voice finally showed some emotion, raw grief that made everyone flinch. My son hates me. My closest advisor spent 30 years manipulating me like a puppet. So no, Heron, I don't particularly care about your border disputes right now. Lucien watched the reactions ripple around the table. Shock, anger, fear. These people had followed Ragnar because he was strong, decisive, terrifying. Seeing him like this, broken and admitting he was broken, was destroying whatever confidence they had left. General Kyle tried again. My king, I understand your grief, but the soldiers need leadership. The people need to see strength. If we project weakness now. Kale is right, Lucien said. Every head turned toward him. Ragnar's eyes finally focused, landing on his son with something between resentment and relief. You want to take over? Go ahead, Ragnar said. You're better at it anyway. I'm not taking over, Lucian said carefully. But I'm also not going to sit here while everyone watches you fall apart and the Empire crumbles because of it. Then what are you suggesting? Lord Heron asked. Lucian stood up and moved to the maps. He'd spent the last 3 days reviewing everything. Territory disputes, supply lines, military positions, political allegiances. Vialor had taught him that power without information was just violence. Real control required understanding every piece on the board. The Eastern clans want secession because they don't believe we can protect them anymore, Lucian said. He pointed to 3 marked territories on the map. They've got legitimate concerns. The harvest failed. Bandits have been raiding supply lines. Local lords are demanding higher taxes to fund reconstruction after last year's skirmishes. He looked around the table. So we give them a reason to stay. We send military support to clear out the bandits. We reduce taxes temporarily and supplement their food stores from the capital's reserves. And we make it very clear that leaving the Empire means losing access to our trade networks and military protection. That's expensive, one of the advisors said. We can't afford to lose 3 clans either, Lucian interrupted. Territory loss leads to further fragmentation. Within 6 months, we'd have a dozen breakaway regions and no empire left to defend. General Kael nodded slowly. The boy's right. Sometimes you have to invest resources to prevent worse losses later. The boy, Lucian thought with dark amusement, is 37 years old and just massacred an invading army by himself. But he let the comment slide. What about the military situation? Another commander asked. We're still recovering from the invasion. If one of the southern clans decides to test us, then we make an example, Lucian said. He met the commander's eyes. We pick one target, the most aggressive, the most likely to cause problems. And we hit them so hard that everyone else remembers why this empire has lasted 50 generations. That sounds like your father's approach, Lord Heron muttered. My father's approach was conquest for the sake of expansion, Lucian said. I'm talking about strategic violence to establish credibility. There's a difference. Ragnar laughed. It was a bitter, ugly sound. Listen to him. 3 days and he's already thinking like a king. I'm thinking like someone who wants to prevent another invasion, Lucian shot back. You're welcome to offer better ideas if you can focus long enough. The room went deadly quiet. Nobody spoke to the Alpha King that way, not even generals with decades of service. But Ragnar just smiled, a ghost of his old predatory grin. There he is. There's the son I raised, cold, calculating, willing to do whatever it takes. You didn't raise me, Lucian said quietly. You threw me away, and someone else rebuilt me from scratch. Don't confuse the result with your work. Ragnar's smile disappeared. Fair enough. He stood up from the table, moving like every joint hurt. You want to run the war council? It's yours. I'm going to bed. Father? Don't, Ragnar said. He didn't turn around, just kept walking toward the door. Don't pretend you care what happens to me. We both know better. He left. The heavy door slammed shut behind him. The remaining council members looked at each other uncertainly. Then slowly, they all turned to face Lucian. General Kael was the first to speak. What are your orders, my lord? Lucian felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. This was it. This was the moment where he stopped being the exiled prince and became something else. Something that carried the survival of an empire on its back. He looked down at the maps. All those territories. All those lives depending on decisions made in this room. Send dispatches to the eastern clans, he said. Offer them the deal I outlined. Military support, tax relief, food supplies. Give them 72 hours to respond. And if they refuse, Lord Heron asked. Then we move to option 2, Lucian said. He pointed to a location on the map. This is Clan Ironpaw. They're the instigators. Take them off the board and the others will fall in line. You're talking about wiping out an entire clan, one of the advisors said nervously. I'm talking about doing what's necessary to hold this empire together. If you've got a gentler solution, I'm listening. Nobody offered one. Lucian spent the next 3 hours working through the logistics, troop movements, supply chains, diplomatic messages that balanced threat and incentive. It turned out running an empire was 90% paperwork and 10% actual violence. By the time the meeting ended, it was past midnight. The council members filed out looking exhausted, but less terrified than when they'd arrived. Someone was making decisions again. Someone was taking control. Lucien stayed behind, staring at the maps in the flickering candlelight. "You did well," Valor said from the shadows. Lucien didn't jump. He'd felt the sorcerer arrive 10 minutes earlier. "Did I?" "Because I just effectively staged a coup against my own father. Your father staged it himself by falling apart in public. You just filled the vacuum before someone worse did. Doesn't make it right." Valor moved closer, his violet eyes reflecting the candlelight. "Right doesn't matter. Effective matters. Your mother asked you to survive and protect this empire. That's exactly what you're doing. By taking everything from my father, your father threw you into the wastelands to die. I'd say you're showing remarkable restraint by not turning him into a puppet and ruling through his corpse." Lucien laughed despite himself. "You're a terrible moral compass. I never claimed otherwise. But I am practical. And practically speaking, you're going to be king within the month whether you want it or not. Might as well start acting like it." The response from the eastern clans arrived 2 days later. Clan Shadowfin and Clan Nightmarch accepted the terms immediately. They sent grateful letters praising Lucien's wisdom and promising renewed loyalty. Clan Ironpaw sent back the severed head of the messenger. Lucien stared at the box sitting on the council table. The head belonged to a young soldier named Marcus, a volunteer from the palace guard who'd been excited about his first diplomatic mission. Now Marcus stared at nothing with dead eyes while dried blood crusted around the ragged stump of his neck. "This is a message," General Kael said grimly. "They're testing you, seeing if you'll actually follow through on your threats." Lucien reached into the box and closed Marcus's eyes. The flesh was cold under his fingers. He remembered being 17 and terrified, stumbling through frozen wastelands while his body shut down piece by piece. He remembered the exact moment he'd accepted death because fighting seemed pointless. This soldier had died believing his mission mattered, believing someone in power actually cared. "Get me everything on Clan Ironpaw," Lucien said. His voice came out flat. "Dead. Leadership structure, territory, population centers, everything." "My lord," one of the advisors said nervously, "if we retaliate now, it could trigger—" "I don't care what it triggers," Lucien interrupted. He looked up and the shadows moved with him, darkening the room. "They killed a messenger under diplomatic protection. They sent his head back as a joke. That doesn't get answered with more negotiations." "What exactly are you planning?" Lord Heron asked. Lucien smiled. It was not a kind expression. "I'm going to visit Clan Ironpaw personally and remind them what happens when you mistake mercy for weakness." Lucien left at dawn with 20 hand-picked warriors and Valor. General Kael wanted to send an army, but Lucien refused. Armies were slow and obvious. What he needed was speed and overwhelming violence delivered so precisely that nobody could mistake the message. They reached Clan Ironpaw's territory by nightfall after riding hard through increasingly rough terrain. The clan controlled a valley full of mining operations and lumber camps, valuable territory that produced significant wealth. Their alpha, a brute named Tauren Ironpaw, ruled from a fortified compound built into the hillside. Lucien left his warriors at the valley entrance with orders to wait for his signal. "Just us?" one of them asked nervously. "Just us," Lucien confirmed. "If I'm not back by dawn, tell General Kael to burn this valley to bedrock." He walked toward the compound with Valor beside him. The sorcerer had remained silent for most of the journey, but now he spoke. "You're planning to kill them all," Valor said. "It wasn't a question. Not all of them. Just the leadership. The rest get one chance to swear loyalty or join their alpha. And if they choose loyalty to Tauren, then they made their choice," Lucien said. He felt the shadows gathering around him like eager pets. "I'm done trying to convince people to do the right thing. From now on, they either obey or they die. Those are the only options. Your mother wouldn't approve. My mother is dead because this empire's enemies thought they could get away with attacking us. I'm going to make sure nobody ever makes that mistake again." They reached the compound gates. Guards stood on either side, big wolves with weapons drawn. They moved to block the path. State your business, one of them growled. Lucien didn't slow down. He kept walking forward like the guards didn't exist. I said state your business. The guard reached out to grab Lucien's shoulder. His hand passed through shadow instead of flesh. Before he could react, the darkness wrapped around his throat and lifted him off his feet. His partner tried to raise the alarm, but Vailor gestured casually and the man simply collapsed, unconscious before he hit the ground. Lucien let the first guard dangle for a few seconds, watching his face turn purple. Then he dropped him and stepped over the gasping body. Tell your alpha I'm here, he said. If he wants to live through the next 10 minutes, he'll come meet me in his hall. The guard scrambled backward and ran inside, shouting for reinforcements. Subtle, Vailor observed. Subtle died when they sent back that soldier's head. They walked through the compound unopposed. Warriors came running from various buildings, but none of them attacked. They just formed a loose perimeter, weapons drawn, waiting for orders from their alpha. The main hall doors swung open. Torn Ironpaw emerged flanked by a dozen of his best fighters. He was exactly what Lucien expected. Massive, scarred, arrogant, the kind of alpha who'd spent his whole life using violence to get what he wanted. Well, well, Torin said, his voice carried across the courtyard. The broken prince finally grew a spine. About time. His warriors laughed. It was a practice sound meant to intimidate. Lucien stopped 20 feet away. You killed my messenger. Damn right I did, Torin said. Boy showed up talking about taxes and military support like we're beggars. Ironpaw doesn't beg. We take what we want. So you sent his head back as a message. Exactly. Torin grinned. Message being, we don't answer to a wolfless freak who thinks shadow magic makes him important. Your father was a real alpha. You're just a mistake that should have stayed dead. More laughter from his warriors. They were enjoying this, watching their alpha humiliate the prince who thought he could give orders. Lucien felt the shadows respond to his anger. They writhed around his feet, hungry and eager. All he had to do was let them loose. All he had to do was stop holding back and this entire compound would be consumed in darkness. But Vailor's words echoed in his mind. There's a difference between controlled violence and mindless destruction. One makes you powerful, the other makes you a rabid dog. Last chance, Lucien said quietly. Swear loyalty to the throne and I'll let you live. Refuse and I'll erase Clan Ironpaw from history. Torin laughed so hard he nearly doubled over. You and what army, boy? I've got 200 warriors in this compound alone. You've got yourself and one ancient sorcerer. The math doesn't work in your favor. Lucien smiled. That's where you're wrong. I don't need an army. He let the shadows explode outward. What happened next wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The darkness swallowed half the compound in seconds, moving with predatory intelligence. Torin's warriors tried to fight, but how do you fight something that has no physical form? Their blades passed through shadow. Their wolves couldn't bite what they couldn't see. The darkness wrapped around them one by one, dragging them down into suffocating blackness. Lucien walked through the chaos, utterly calm, directing the shadows with small gestures. A flick of his wrist, and 3 warriors collapsed, screaming as the darkness invaded their lungs. A pointed finger and 2 more simply disappeared, consumed so completely there wasn't even blood left behind. Torin Ironpaw finally understood he'd made a catastrophic mistake. He shifted into his massive wolf form and charged at Lucien with desperate fury. Lucien didn't move. The shadows caught Torin mid-leap and slammed him into the ground hard enough to crack stone. They wrapped around the alpha's wolf form, squeezing until bones began to pop. Torin shifted back to human, gasping for air. Please, he wheezed. Please, I'll swear loyalty. You had your chance, Lucien said. He crouched down so they were face to face. You chose violence. You chose cruelty. You killed a boy who was just doing his job because you thought it would be funny. He stood back up. Now you get to be the punchline. The shadows tightened. Torin's scream cut off abruptly as his windpipe collapsed. His eyes bulged. His face turned purple, then blue. Then he stopped moving entirely. Lucien let the body drop and turned to face the surviving warriors. There were maybe 50 left, the ones who'd been far enough from the initial assault to avoid getting killed. Anyone else want to test me? He asked. The warriors dropped their weapons. Some of them fell to their knees. Others just stood there shaking. Good, Lucien said. From this moment forward, Clan Ironpaw answers to the throne. Your new alpha is whoever survives the selection trial next month. Until then, General Kael's officers will manage this territory. Anyone who has a problem with that can join Torin. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Lucien walked out of the compound with Valor beside him. Behind them, the survivors began the grim work of collecting their dead. You killed 40 people in under 5 minutes, Valor said once they were clear of the valley. How do you feel? Empty, Lucien admitted. Like I should feel something, regret, satisfaction, anything, but there's just nothing. That's the price, Valor said quietly. The more you use shadow magic, the more it numbs you to normal human emotions. Eventually you become the weapon instead of the person wielding it. Can it be reversed? I don't know. Nobody's ever tried. They walked in silence for a while. Lucien's warriors fell into formation around them, none of them speaking. They'd watched the massacre from a distance. Now they looked at Lucien like he was something inhuman. Maybe he was. When they reached camp, Lucien dismissed everyone except Valor. Then he stood at the edge of the firelight and stared into the darkness beyond. My mother asked me to protect this empire, he said, to make it better. But how do I make anything better when I'm becoming exactly what my father was? When I'm solving problems with overwhelming violence and terror? Valor stepped up beside him. You're not your father. He ruled through bloodline supremacy and tribal fear. You're trying to build something more functional. The violence is just a tool. It doesn't feel like a tool. It feels like who I am now. Then prove otherwise. Show them you can be brutal when necessary, but also fair, that you can inspire loyalty through more than just fear. How? Valor smiled. That's the question you'll spend the rest of your life answering. Welcome to leadership. The news spread fast. By the time Lucien returned to the capital 3 days later, everyone knew what he'd done. Clan Ironpaw's massacre had become legend overnight, exaggerated and embellished until some versions claimed he'd killed 500 warriors single-handedly. The Eastern clans sent renewed pledges of loyalty. The military commanders looked at him with new respect mixed with terror. The nobles started attending council meetings again because not showing up seemed like a good way to end up on his bad side. And Ragnar finally emerged from his grief long enough to confront his son. Lucien was in the strategy room reviewing supply reports when the Alpha King walked in. Ragnar looked better than he had at the funeral, cleaner, less broken, but there was still a hollowness in his eyes that probably wouldn't fade. You massacred an entire clan leadership, Ragnar said without preamble. Lucien didn't look up from his reports. They killed my messenger, sent his head back in a box. I responded proportionally. Proportionally? You turned their compound into a graveyard, and now the other clans remember why this empire has lasted 50 generations. Was I supposed to send them a stern letter instead? Ragnar moved closer. He was still physically imposing despite the grief, still dangerous despite the exhaustion. You're becoming exactly what I was, using fear and violence to maintain control. No, Lucien said. He finally looked up. I'm becoming what I need to be to save this empire from your mistakes. There's a difference. Ragnar's hands clenched into fists. My mistakes? Boy, I built this empire from conquest and bloodline supremacy and throwing away anyone who didn't fit your narrow definition of strength. Yeah, I know. I lived it. The Alpha King's face went red. You don't know what it takes to hold power, to make the hard choices that keep an empire together. Lucien stood up slowly. The shadows moved with him, darkening the room. You mean like choosing fear over understanding? Like banishing your only son because he embarrassed you? Those hard choices? Ragnar took a step back. For the first time in Lucien's memory, his father looked genuinely frightened. I'm trying to apologize, Ragnar said quietly. I'm trying to make this right. Then abdicate, Lucien said. Step down officially and let me rebuild without having to navigate around your legacy every time I make a decision. You want me to just give up? To hand over everything I've built? You already have. You fell apart after Mother died. The council comes to me now. The military answers to me. You're king in name only, and we both know it. Ragnar's shoulders slumped. So that's it? I made mistakes and now you're taking everything? You took everything from me first, Lucien said. The difference is I'm actually trying to build something better instead of just maintaining your broken system. And you think you can do better? You think ruling through shadow magic and terror is an improvement? I think ruling through competence is an improvement. The terror is just what happens when people test me. They stared at each other across the strategy room. Father and son. Two versions of strength that couldn't coexist in the same space. I'll think about it, Ragnar said finally. The abdication. He turned to leave but paused at the door. For what it's worth, he said without turning around, your mother would be proud of you, not for the violence, for the fact that you came back at all, that you're trying to save something instead of just destroying it in revenge. Lucian felt something crack in his chest. The careful control he'd maintained since the funeral wavered. She'd also hate what I'm becoming, he said quietly. What this power is turning me into. Ragnar looked back over his shoulder. Then don't let it finish. Don't become so much the weapon that you forget you were human first. He left before Lucian could respond. Lucian stood alone in the strategy room and wondered if that advice came 20 years too late. Scout. The formal coronation happened 2 weeks later. Ragnar stepped down quietly in a private ceremony attended only by the High Council. No drama, no speeches. Just a tired man removing a crown and handing it to his son before walking away from a throne he'd held for 40 years. The public ceremony was scheduled for the following day. A massive affair with representatives from every clan, foreign dignitaries, elaborate rituals. Sarah had been managing the logistics with terrifying efficiency, turning the entire capital into a celebration of the new king. Lucian hated every second of it. He stood in his private chambers the night before the coronation, staring at the crown sitting on a velvet cushion. It was older than the empire itself, black metal worked with silver wolves and obsidian stones. 50 generations had worn it. Now it would sit on the head of someone who'd never awakened a wolf. Ironic didn't begin to cover it. Someone knocked on the door. Lucian knew who it was without asking. Valor's presence had a specific feeling after 20 years. Come in. The sorcerer entered, looking exactly as unimpressed with ceremony as Lucian felt. He glanced at the crown and shook his head. Heavy lies the head, and all that meaningless poetry, Valor said. Ready for tomorrow? No, Lucian admitted. I spent 20 years planning revenge and power. I never actually thought about what ruling would feel like. It feels exactly like this. Doubt, pressure, the constant knowledge that every decision affects thousands of lives, and you'll never know if you made the right choice until years later. Comforting. I'm not here to comfort you. I'm here to make sure you don't forget the most important lesson. Which is? Valor moved closer. His violet eyes blazed with intensity. Power is a tool, not a destination. You're about to have more of it than anyone in the North. More than your father. More than any alpha before you. The question is what you do with it. He placed one hand on Lucian's shoulder. Do you use it to become another tyrant? Another ruler who maintains control through fear and violence? Or do you actually try to build something better? I don't know how to do better, Lucian said. I only know violence. You made sure of that. I made sure you could survive, Valor corrected. What you do beyond survival is entirely up to you. Your mother believed you could change this empire. Prove her right. He turned to leave but paused at the door. One more thing. The shadow magic will keep trying to consume you, keep pushing you toward cruelty and detachment. Fight it. Stay human enough to remember why you're doing this. And if I can't, then I'll put you down myself, Valor said simply. I didn't spend 20 years creating a monster just to watch it destroy everything we worked for. He left Lucian alone with the crown and the weight of tomorrow. The coronation ceremony was everything Sarah had promised. Elaborate, expensive, overwhelming. Thousands packed the throne room and the courtyards beyond. Every noble house sent representatives. Every clan sent warriors in ceremonial armor. Foreign ambassadors stood in designated sections, watching the proceedings with calculating eyes. Lucian walked down the center aisle in black armor, etched with silver runes that Valor had woven with protective enchantments. The shadows followed him, visible to everyone, a living cloak that marked him as something other than human. The crowd murmured as he passed. Fear, awe, curiosity. He felt all of it pressing against him like a physical weight. Elder Morvain waited at the throne with the crown. The old wolf looked like he might collapse at any moment, but he'd insisted on performing the ceremony. Tradition demanded it. Lucien knelt before the throne. The stone was cold against his knee. Morvain raised his voice to carry through the massive space. 50 generations of Alpha Kings have ruled this empire through strength and blood and wolf. Today we crown a new king who represents a new kind of power. One built not through birthright, but through survival and will and the mastery of forces we barely understand. He lifted the crown. Lucien Nightvale, do you swear to protect this empire and its people? To rule with justice and strength? To uphold the ancient laws and forge new ones as necessary? I do, Lucien said. The crown settled on his head and something shifted in the air. Power recognizing power. The empire accepting its new ruler. Lucien stood and turned to face the crowd. Every eye was on him. Every person in that room was waiting to see what kind of king he would be. He opened his mouth to give the speech Sarah had carefully prepared. Words about unity and strength and honoring tradition while embracing change. But what came out was something else entirely. For 50 generations, Lucien said, his voice carrying through absolute silence, this empire has valued bloodline over ability. We've thrown away talented people because they weren't born with wolves. We've maintained power through fear and conquest instead of cooperation and fairness. Today that changes. He let the shadows spread through the room, not threatening, just present. A reminder of what he was. I'm not my father. I don't rule because of bloodline or tradition. I rule because I survived what would have killed anyone else and became powerful enough to protect this empire from those who would destroy it. And under my reign, we measure worth by what people accomplish, not what they're born with. The crowd stirred. Some nobles looked angry. Others looked intrigued. Anyone who wants to challenge my right to rule, step forward now. We'll settle it the old way. Trial by combat. You bring your wolf, I'll bring my shadows. We'll see who's still standing. Nobody moved. The silence stretched on until it became clear nobody was stepping forward. Good, Lucien said. Then understand this. I will be fair. I will listen to counsel. I will try to rule with justice instead of just violence. But I will not tolerate treason. I will not accept weakness. And I will not watch this empire fragment because people think change means opportunity to grab power. He reached up and touched the crown sitting on his head. This crown has sat on the heads of conquerors and tyrants for generations. Today it sits on someone who wants to build instead of just maintain. Help me build, and you'll prosper. Fight me, and you'll learn why Clan Ironpaw no longer exists. The shadows pulled back. Lucien descended from the throne and walked out of the ceremony, leaving everyone to process what they'd just witnessed. Sarah caught up with him in the corridor. That was not the speech we prepared. No, Lucien agreed. It was better. You threatened half the nobility and told them their entire belief system was wrong. And now they know exactly where they stand. No ambiguity, no wondering what kind of ruler I'll be. Just clear expectations. Sarah stared at him for a moment, then started laughing. You're either brilliant or insane. Possibly both. Definitely both, Lucien said. He kept walking toward his chambers, suddenly exhausted. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to be alone before I do something else dramatic. He closed the door to his chambers and finally let the mask drop. The crown sat heavy on his head, heavier than metal, and jewels should be. Lucien looked at his reflection in the polished mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Somewhere between 17 and 37, between the Broken Prince and the Shadow King, he'd become something else entirely. The question Valor had posed echoed in his mind. Would he use this power to build something better? Or would he become another tyrant wearing a different crown? He thought about his mother's last words, about Ragnar's warning not to let the weapon consume the human, about Sarah's blunt assessment of an empire on the edge of collapse. Tomorrow he'd start making real decisions. Tomorrow he'd find out if he could actually change anything, or if 20 years of violence had made him too broken for anything except more violence. But tonight, King Lucien Nightvale sat alone in the dark and wondered if anyone who'd walked the path he'd walked could ever really find their way back to the light. The shadows gathered around him like faithful dogs, and he realized with cold certainty that the answer might be no. 3 months into his reign, Lucien finally understood why his father had looked so exhausted all the time. Ruling wasn't glorious battles and dramatic speeches. It was endless council meetings about grain distribution and border disputes, and which minor noble's third cousin deserved a land grant. It was paperwork that multiplied like a plague, no matter how many hours he spent signing documents. It was diplomatic dinners where he had to smile at people he wanted to strangle while they probed for weaknesses with every carefully worded question. The empire was stable. That was something. The eastern clans had fallen in line after the Iron Paw massacre. Trade routes were secure. The military had rebuilt to 75% strength. No major threats on the horizon. But stability didn't feel like victory. It felt like holding your breath underwater and hoping you could last until the next crisis hit. Lucien sat in the strategy room reviewing supply reports when Sarah knocked and entered without waiting for permission. She'd gotten comfortable with him over the past months, comfortable enough to skip formalities when time mattered. "We've got a problem," she said. Lucien didn't look up from the numbers. "We always have a problem. Which one is it today?" "General Kael just arrived back from the Northern Territories. He's requesting an immediate private audience. Says it's urgent." Something in her tone made Lucien finally look up. Sarah's face was carefully neutral, but he'd learned to read the micro-expressions she tried to hide. The slight tension around her eyes. The way she held her shoulders too rigid. She was worried. "Send him in," Lucien said. General Kyle entered looking like he'd ridden hard for days without stopping. Mud caked his boots. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. The old warrior moved stiffly, favoring his left side like he'd taken a beating recently. "My king," Kael said. He didn't bother with a bow. "No time for ceremony. We need to talk. Alone." Lucien glanced at Sarah. She nodded once and left, closing the door behind her. "Talk," Lucien said. Kael crossed to the table and spread out a map with locations marked in red ink. "These are the sites of attacks over the past 6 weeks. Northern border. 11 separate incidents targeting our supply convoys and patrol routes. Bandits? That's what I thought at first. But bandits don't move with military precision. They don't hit multiple targets simultaneously across a 100-mile front, and they sure as hell don't leave behind calling cards." He pulled something from his pocket and dropped it on the table. A silver medallion with a wolf head design. Lucien recognized it immediately, the symbol of the Shadow Guard, his father's elite personal unit. "Impossible," Lucien said. The Shadow Guard was disbanded after father stepped down. Most of them retired or transferred to regular military service. "Most of them did," Kael agreed, "but about 20 didn't. They disappeared the week after your coronation. We assumed they'd left the Empire. Turns out they've been organizing something in the Northern Territories." "Organizing what?" Kael's expression went grim. "A resistance movement. They're calling themselves the True Blood faction. Their message is that you're a pretender king, that the throne belongs to someone with actual wolf blood, not shadow magic. They're recruiting disillusioned warriors and nobles who think the old ways were better. How many? Unknown. At least a few hundred fighters based on the attack patterns. Maybe more. They've got support infrastructure, supply lines, safe houses, recruitment networks. This isn't some angry mob. It's an organized military operation." Lucien felt cold settle into his bones. 3 months. He'd had 3 months of relative peace, and now this. Who's leading them? Kael hesitated. "That's the part you're really not going to like. Just tell me." The old warrior met his eyes. "Your father." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Lucien heard himself laugh. It was a hollow, ugly sound. "You're telling me Ragnar is organizing a rebellion against me?" He abdicated. He walked away. "Why would he?" "Because he regrets it," Kael interrupted. "Because he's spent 3 months watching you rule and decided you're destroying everything he built. Because enough nobles whispered in his ear about the good old days when strength meant wolf strength, and he started believing them." The general leaned forward. "I've got testimony from 3 separate sources. Former Shadow Guard members who got cold feet and came to us. They all confirm it. Ragnar's running the operation. He's the figurehead bringing in the old loyalists." Lucien stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the capital looked peaceful. People going about their lives. Merchants selling goods. Children playing in the streets. They had no idea their former king was trying to tear everything down. "How long have you known?" 2 days. I spent that time verifying the intelligence before bringing it to you." I'm sorry, my king. If I'd caught this earlier. Don't apologize for being thorough, Lucian said. He turned back to face Kael. What's their end game? Civil war. They're building strength in the north while trying to recruit southern clans. When they think they have enough support, they'll march on the capital. Frame it as liberating the empire from your rule. And people will believe it. People will follow him. Kael nodded slowly. Your father was king for 40 years. A lot of warriors grew up respecting him, fearing him. When he says the empire needs saving, they'll listen. Lucian felt something crack inside his chest, not quite his heart, something deeper. The fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, his father had actually meant those apologies, that the moment at his mother's grave had been real. Apparently not. What do you need from me? Kael asked. Time to think. And absolute secrecy. If word gets out that Ragnar's alive and organizing against me, it'll split the empire in half before we can respond. Understood. My lips are sealed until you give the order. Kael left. Lucien stood alone in the strategy room and tried to process what he'd just learned. His father was betraying him. Again. But this time it was worse, because this time Ragnar had looked him in the eye and pretended to care before walking away to plan his destruction. The shadows gathered around Lucien's feet, responding to his rage. They wanted to lash out, to hunt down every True Blood supporter and tear them apart, to make Ragnar watch his rebellion burn before choking the life out of him personally. And wasn't that exactly what Vaelor had warned him about? The darkness feeding on anger until violence became the only response he could imagine? Lucien took a breath, then another, forced the shadows back under control. He needed to be smarter than rage, needed to think this through before making decisions that couldn't be unmade. But one truth crystallized in his mind with perfect clarity. His father had just declared war. Not openly, not honestly, but through shadow networks and whispered recruitment and targeted attacks on Lucian's authority. And if there was one thing Lucian had learned from 20 years of survival, it was this. When someone declared war on you, you hit back hard enough that they never tried again. Lucian called an emergency council meeting that night. He invited only the people he absolutely trusted. Sarah, General Kael, Lord Heron Frostmane, who'd proven himself competent and loyal, and a handful of senior military commanders who demonstrated they cared more about stability than bloodline politics. Vaelor stood in the shadows at the back of the room. The sorcerer rarely attended official meetings, but Lucian had requested his presence specifically. If they were about to discuss shadow warfare against his father, he needed the man who'd taught him everything about surviving impossible situations. Lucian laid out the intelligence without sugarcoating anything. The attacks, the True Blood faction, the Shadow Guard remnants, and finally, the identity of their leader. The room erupted. Ragnar is alive? Lord Heron looked like someone had punched him. He's organizing against you? That's treason, Sarah finished. That's exactly what it is. One of the commanders, a scarred woman named Captain Vex, shook her head. With respect, my king, are we certain? Former Alpha King Ragnar was many things, but I can't believe he'd actually try to overthrow his own son. The evidence is solid, Kael said. Multiple independent sources, physical proof, attack patterns that match Shadow Guard tactics he personally developed. This is going to split the Empire, another commander muttered. When people find out, they're not finding out, Lucian interrupted. Not yet. Right now we have an advantage. Ragnar doesn't know we've identified him. He thinks he's operating in secret. We need to use that. Use it how? Lord Heron asked. Lucian looked around the table. Every face showed some combination of shock, anger, fear. These were the people who'd chosen to follow him despite his lack of wolf blood, despite the shadow magic, despite everything that made him different from the traditional Alpha King. He couldn't let them down, couldn't let Ragnar tear apart the stability they'd fought to build. We infiltrate the True Blood faction, Lucian said. Plant our own people inside their networks. Learn their plans, their supply lines, their supporters. And when we've mapped the entire operation, we cut it apart piece by piece. You're talking about shadow war, Vaelor said from the back of the room. Intelligence operations and targeted strikes instead of open confrontation. Exactly. If we march an army north to crush them, it becomes a public spectacle. Ragnar gets to frame himself as the righteous rebel fighting a tyrant. But if they just start disappearing, if their supply lines dry up and their safe houses get compromised and their recruits vanish, then it's not a rebellion. It's just criminals getting what criminals deserve. That's ruthless, Captain Vex said. There was respect in her voice. Ruthless is what the situation demands, Lucien said. My father taught me that. He just didn't expect me to learn the lesson this well. What about Ragnar himself? Sarah asked. Do we capture him? Kill him? Put him on trial? Lucien felt the shadows stir at that question. Part of him wanted to say, kill him, end this the way his father had ended so many threats. Quick, brutal, final. But another part, the part that remembered his mother's face, couldn't quite make that leap. We capture him alive if possible, Lucien said. Let him answer for what he's done in front of the entire empire. Show everyone that even a former king isn't above justice. And if capture isn't possible, Kyle asked quietly, then we do what's necessary to protect the empire. The unspoken truth hung in the air. If it came down to Ragnar or stability, Lucien would choose stability, even if it meant killing his own father. The council spent the next 3 hours hammering out details. Which agents to send north, how to identify true blood sympathizers without tipping them off, supply interdiction strategies, communication protocols. By the time they finished, it was past midnight. Everyone filed out except Valor. The sorcerer moved to stand beside Lucien at the strategy table. You're handling this better than I expected. What did you expect? Valor smiled slightly. Honestly? I thought you'd immediately ride north with an army and burn everything your father touched. The fact that you're thinking strategically instead of just reacting is progress. I learned from a very paranoid teacher. Paranoid keeps you alive. The sorcerer's expression turned serious. But I need to ask, when you catch him, can you actually do it? Can you look your father in the eye and make the hard choice? Lucien stared at the map showing all the northern territory Ragnar was trying to turn against him. I spent 20 years surviving in the wastelands because he threw me away like garbage. I think I can handle whatever comes next. Surviving and executing your own father are different things. Then I guess we'll find out which one matters more. The infiltration operation took 6 weeks to set up. Lucien's agents posed as disgruntled former palace guards and sympathetic nobles. They filtered into the northern territories one by one, making contact with true blood recruiters and slowly working their way deeper into the network. The intelligence that came back painted a disturbing picture. Ragnar had built an actual parallel command structure. Leadership councils, training camps, supply depots hidden in valleys and caves. The True Blood faction wasn't just a resistance movement, it was becoming a shadow empire within the empire, and they were planning something big. Agent reports indicated a major gathering scheduled for the autumn equinox, 6 weeks out. All the faction leaders converging on a fortified compound deep in the northern mountains. Ragnar would be there to address his followers and finalize plans for the march on the capital. It was the perfect opportunity. Lucien spent those weeks preparing, not just militarily, training strike teams, positioning forces, planning extraction routes, but mentally. Because he knew what was coming, knew that the moment he'd been avoiding for 3 months was finally arriving. Valor found him on the palace ramparts the night before the operation launched. Lucien stood watching the stars and thinking about his mother, wondering what she'd say if she could see him now. You're thinking too much, Valor observed. Someone has to. The sorcerer leaned against the stone wall. I've taught a lot of students over the years. Some were more talented, some were stronger. But you know what made you different? Lucien glanced at him. What? You never quit, even when you should have. Even when dying would have been easier. You just kept surviving out of pure spite. That's supposed to be inspiring? It's supposed to remind you that whatever happens tomorrow, you've faced worse. You survived being thrown into cursed wastelands as a 17-year-old kid with nothing. You survived 20 years of brutal training that would have broken most people. You survived coming back here and taking a throne that shouldn't have been yours. Valor pushed off the wall. Dealing with a treacherous father is just one more thing you'll survive. Unless he kills me first. He won't. Because you're stronger than him now. Not just magically, tactically, strategically, mentally. Ragnar's operating on old playbooks and wounded pride. You're operating with clarity and purpose. Lucien wanted to believe that, wanted to feel the confidence Valor projected so easily. but all he felt was tired. What if I become him? Lucian asked quietly. What if dealing with this turns me into exactly the kind of ruthless tyrant he was? Then you'll have company in hell, and I'll make sure to remind you both how disappointing you are. Lucian laughed despite everything. Thanks for the pep talk. Any time. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow you're going to need every advantage. What? The strike happened at dawn. Lucian led the assault personally with 50 elite warriors in Valor. They'd spent 2 days hiking through mountain terrain to reach the compound without being detected. The True Blood faction had guards posted, but they were watching the roads, not expecting an attack force to come through the wilderness. The compound was exactly what the intelligence described. A fortified manor built into a cliff face with a single entrance and high walls. Defensible against a conventional assault. But Lucian didn't do conventional. He waited until the guard rotation changed at sunrise. Then he let the shadows loose. The darkness swept through the compound like a living flood, swallowing guards before they could raise an alarm. Lucian walked in behind the shadow wave with his warriors following in tight formation. They moved through corridors systematically. Anyone who resisted died instantly. Anyone who surrendered got restrained and left for the follow-up teams to process. Lucian felt nothing as bodies dropped. No satisfaction, no regret, just cold efficiency. The main hall sat at the center of the compound. Intelligence said that's where the faction leadership would gather for morning briefings. Lucian reached the doors and paused, listening. Voices inside. At least 20 people from the sound of it, and one voice that cut through all the others with absolute authority. Ragnar. Lucian gestured to his warriors to fan out. Then he placed both hands on the doors and let the shadows pour through the cracks. The screaming started immediately. He kicked the doors open and walked into chaos. His shadows had wrapped around half the people in the room, pinning them against walls and floor. The other half were scrambling for weapons or trying to escape through windows. But Lucian only cared about one person. Ragnar stood at the far end of the hall in full wolf form, massive and terrifying, all teeth and claws and murder. He'd shifted the moment the shadows hit. "Father," Lucian said. The word came out cold enough to frost the air. Ragnar shifted back to human. He stood there naked and defiant, not bothering to show shame or fear. "So, you found us, faster than I expected. Did you really think I wouldn't? That I'd just let you organize a rebellion and wait politely for you to destroy me? I thought you might be too soft. Too weak." Ragnar smiled, and it was his old predatory grin. Guess I was wrong about that, at least. "Why?" Lucian stepped closer, the shadows moving with him. "Why did you do this? You abdicated. You walked away. You said you wanted me to build something better." "I lied," Ragnar said simply, or maybe I believed it for a few weeks before reality set in. "You're not building anything, boy. You're tearing down everything I spent 40 years creating, destroying the bloodline traditions, making weakness acceptable, turning the empire into something unrecognizable. You mean I'm making it better, making it fair?" "Fair," Ragnar spat. "Fairness is what weak people demand when they can't compete. The old ways worked. They kept us strong. They kept us feared. You're turning us soft and calling it progress. I'm ending centuries of cruelty and calling it evolution." They circled each other like fighters looking for an opening. Around them, Lucian's warriors had secured the room. All the True Blood leadership was captured or dead. It was just father and son now, the way it always should have been. "You know what the truly pathetic part is?" Lucian said. "I actually believed your apology. At Mother's grave, when you said you were wrong, I thought maybe you'd actually learned something." "I was wrong about you being weak," Ragnar said, "but I wasn't wrong about you being dangerous. You're exactly what I feared 20 years ago, someone who will destroy the Empire trying to save it. Then maybe the Empire deserves to be destroyed." Ragnar's eyes went amber. His wolf was right there beneath the surface, barely contained. "You ungrateful little—" "Don't," Lucian interrupted. "Don't pretend this is about gratitude. You threw me away. You let me think I was worthless for 20 years. And now you're angry because I came back powerful enough that you can't control me. I'm angry because you're throwing away your heritage. Because you're too blind to see that what you call cruelty was actually the foundation of our strength. No. What you call strength was just fear wearing a crown." The shadows exploded outward, wrapping around Ragnar before he could shift. They lifted the former Alpha King off his feet and slammed him into the wall hard enough to crack stone. Ragnar struggled, but the darkness held firm. "You're going to kill me," he gasped. "Your own father." "I should," Lucian said. He walked closer until they were face to face. "You've given me every reason. Treason, rebellion, organizing attacks that killed my people. But you know what stops me?" "What?" "The fact that killing you would prove you were right, that I am the monster you always feared, that power corrupts everyone eventually." He let the shadows loosen just slightly. "So instead, you're going to stand trial. You're going to face the entire empire and answer for what you've done. And when they strip you of every honor, every title, every shred of dignity you ever had, you'll finally understand what it felt like to be me at 17. Ragnar stared at him. For the first time in Lucian's memory, his father looked genuinely uncertain. "You think a trial will work? Half the empire still loves me. They'll see you as the usurper, the pretender. Then they'll learn the truth. Because I've got testimony from dozens of your followers, evidence of every attack you planned, every supply convoy you hit, every soldier you killed. By the time we're done, history will remember you as a traitor who couldn't accept that his time was over." Lucien turned to his warriors. "Take him. Make sure he's secure. I want him alive and unharmed for the trial." They moved forward with chains specially forged to hold an alpha. Ragnar didn't resist as they bound him. He just kept staring at Lucian with an expression that might have been pride, or might have been hatred, or might have been both. "You've become exactly what I tried to prevent," Ragnar said quietly. "A ruler who uses fear and power to crush anyone who disagrees." "No," Lucien said. "I've become someone who does what's necessary to protect people from rulers like you." But the universe had other plans. They were leading Ragnar out through the compound when the first explosion hit. The entire north wall detonated in fire and shrapnel. Lucien's warriors scattered, thrown by the blast. The chains holding Ragnar shattered, and through the smoke and chaos new fighters poured in, at least 100 warriors wearing true blood colors. It was a trap within a trap. Ragnar shifted instantly, his massive wolf form tearing free. He grabbed the nearest weapon, a fallen guard sword, and threw himself into the fighting with savage joy. Lucian realized the terrible truth in that moment. Ragnar hadn't been captured. He'd let himself be captured. He'd known Lucian would come personally, and he'd arranged for a secondary force to hit them at the perfect moment. The old bastard had outplayed him. Vialor appeared at Lucian's side, his hands already crackling with power. "We need to leave. Now." "Not without finishing this," Lucien said. He let the shadows explode outward, catching a dozen attacking warriors and crushing them instantly, but more kept coming. And in the chaos, Ragnar was cutting his way toward the exit. Lucien chased after him, shadows streaming in his wake. They burst out of the compound into the mountain dawn, and Ragnar was waiting. The former Alpha King stood at the edge of a cliff, his wolf form massive against the sunrise. Behind him, the Trueblood reinforcements were still pouring into the compound, overwhelming Lucian's outnumbered warriors. Ragnar shifted back to human. He stood there at the precipice, bleeding from a dozen wounds but grinning like a man who'd just won a war. "Did you really think I'd make it easy?" he called across the distance. "Did you think I'd just roll over and accept defeat?" Lucien walked forward slowly. The shadows gathered around him like a storm. "This is over, Father. Even if you escape today, I'll hunt you down. I'll destroy every safe house, every supply line, every person who helps you. I'll make sure the True Blood faction becomes a cautionary tale." "Maybe," Ragnar said. "Or maybe I'll become the rallying point for everyone who's tired of your rule. Maybe this is just the beginning." He stepped backward off the cliff. Lucien lunged forward, but he was too far away. He could only watch as his father fell, shifting mid-drop back into his wolf form. Ragnar hit the tree canopy 50 feet below and crashed through the branches before disappearing into the forest. "Damn it," Lucien snarled. He sent shadows racing down the cliff face, but they found nothing. Ragnar had survived the fall and vanished into terrain he knew intimately. The former Alpha King had escaped, and worse, he'd proven a devastating point. Lucien could win battles, could crush individual cells of the rebellion, could even capture his father temporarily. But actually ending this? Actually bringing Ragnar to justice? That was going to require something Lucien hadn't anticipated. It was going to require becoming the very thing his mother had begged him not to become. The aftermath was a bloodbath. Lucien's forces won the compound fight, but at severe cost. 23 dead, 40 wounded. And every captured True Blood fighter chose death over interrogation, killing themselves before they could reveal information about the broader network. Fanatics. All of them. The ride back to the capital took 4 days. Lucien spent them in grim silence, replaying the moment his father stepped off that cliff. The moment everything had gone wrong. Sarah was waiting when they arrived. She took one look at his face and knew. He got away. Not just got away, Lucien said bitterly. He planned the whole thing. Let me think I was winning while he set up an escape that made me look incompetent. You're not incompetent. You're up against someone with 40 years of tactical experience who's willing to sacrifice his own people for strategic advantage. That's supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to remind you that this is a long war, not a single battle. We hurt them today. We killed their leadership. We captured intelligence. That matters. But Ragnar's still out there, still organizing, still recruiting people who think the old ways were better. Sarah stepped closer. So what's your next move? Lucien stared at the palace in the distance. His palace now. His responsibility. His empire to protect even when the cost kept rising. We escalate, he said. No more trying to be fair. No more hoping people will see reason. From now on, anyone associated with the True Blood faction is an enemy combatant. We hunt them down systematically, and we don't stop until every cell is destroyed and my father is in chains or dead. That's going to cost you, Sarah warned. Not just in lives, in the kind of ruler you become. Then that's the price. He walked into the palace, leaving her standing there, and he knew she was right. This path he was choosing, the ruthless one, the one that prioritized victory over morality, would change him in ways he couldn't predict. But Ragnar had left him no choice. By refusing to accept defeat, by continuing to fight and organize and destroy, his father had forced Lucien's hand. If the only way to protect the Empire was to become a tyrant who eliminated threats without mercy, then that's what Lucien would become. His mother would have been devastated. Valor would probably approve. And somewhere in the mountains, Ragnar was laughing because he'd successfully pushed his son toward the exact darkness he'd always feared. Lucien sat in the throne room that night, alone except for the shadows that never left him anymore. The crown sat heavy on his head, heavier than metal had any right to be. He'd wanted to be different, to rule with justice instead of fear, to prove that strength didn't require cruelty. But his father had just taught him the cruelest lesson of all. Sometimes good intentions weren't enough. Sometimes you had to become the monster to stop worse monsters from winning. And the truly terrifying part was how easy that transformation felt. How natural it was to let the darkness take over. How much simpler everything became when you stopped caring about being fair and just focused on being effective. Lucien felt the last pieces of his humanity cracking under the weight of what he needed to do. And in that moment, sitting alone on a throne, won through exile and pain and shadow magic, he finally understood why his father had looked so exhausted all those years. Power wasn't glorious. It was a slow-motion drowning where every choice pulled you deeper into moral compromise until you couldn't remember what the surface even looked like. But he was already drowning, had been since the moment they dragged him out of that throne room 20 years ago. The only question now was whether he'd take the whole empire down with him or find some way to save it before the darkness consumed everything he'd fought to become. The shadows gathered closer, waiting for his decision. And Lucien Nightvale, the wolfless king who'd survived the impossible, made the choice that would define his reign and destroy whatever remained of his soul. He would win, no matter the cost, no matter who he had to become. Because losing meant his father was right all along, and that was the one thing Lucien absolutely could not accept. The war turned savage in ways Lucien hadn't anticipated. 2 months after Ragnar's escape, the True Blood faction stopped playing defensively. They hit supply convoys in broad daylight, assassinated loyal nobles in their own homes, burned entire villages that refused to support their cause. The message was clear: submit or die. And people were listening. Reports flooded in from across the empire. Clans that had sworn loyalty to Lucien were quietly sending representatives to meet with Ragnar's people. Noble houses were hedging their bets, keeping communication channels open with both sides. Even some of Lucien's own military commanders were showing signs of wavering, not because they supported the rebellion, but because they weren't sure their king could actually win. Doubt was a poison that spread faster than any plague. Lucien stood in the strategy room surrounded by maps marked with red ink showing every attack, every defection, every territory slipping from his control. The Empire was bleeding, and he couldn't stop it fast enough. "We're losing," Lord Heron said quietly. The old noble looked like he'd aged a decade in 2 months. Not militarily, not yet, but in the hearts of the people. They're starting to believe Ragnar's propaganda. "What propaganda?" Lucien asked, though he already knew. "That you're a tyrant who rules through fear and shadow magic instead of legitimate authority. That the Empire was stronger under traditional leadership. That your reforms are destroying centuries of culture and strength." Sarah slammed her hand on the table. "It's all lies. Everything Lucien's done has been to make this empire more fair, more stable." "Doesn't matter if it's lies," General Kyle interrupted. "What matters is people believe them. And right now your father's winning the propaganda war." Lucien felt the shadows stir around his feet. They always did when his control started slipping, when the anger got too close to the surface. "Then we changed tactics," he said. "No more defensive posturing, no more waiting for them to hit us. We take the fight to them." "How?" Captain Vex asked. "We don't even know where Ragnar is operating from anymore. He moves constantly, never stays in one location more than a few days. So we make him come to us," Lucien said. He pointed to a location on the map, the capital itself. "We announce a public ceremony, a grand gathering where I'll address the Empire and present evidence of Ragnar's treason, make it impossible for him to ignore." "That's bait," Valor observed from the shadows. "You're putting yourself out there hoping he'll take the shot." "Exactly, because my father's ego won't let him resist. He'll see it as an opportunity to strike at me publicly and humiliate me the way I tried to humiliate him." "And if he brings an army?" Lord Heron asked nervously. "Then we'll be ready. Every loyal warrior we have, every defensive position fortified. We turn the capital into a trap and crush his rebellion in one decisive battle." The room went quiet. Everyone was calculating odds, running scenarios, trying to figure out if this plan was brilliant or suicidal. "It's a huge risk," Sarah finally said. "If we're wrong about him taking the bait, you'll look weak. If we're right but lose the battle, the war's over." "We're already losing slowly," Lucien said. "At least this way we force a conclusion. Win or die, no more slow bleeding." General Kyle nodded slowly. "I fought beside your father. Fought against him too, back when I served the Eastern clans. The boy's right. Ragnar won't be able to resist this. His pride demands a public confrontation." "Then it's decided," Lucien said. "We send the announcement tomorrow. The ceremony happens in 2 weeks. That gives us time to prepare and gives him time to organize whatever response he's planning." "And if we win?" Captain Vex asked. "If we actually capture or kill him in front of the entire empire?" "Then the rebellion dies with him. Martyrs only work if there's ambiguity about their cause. When people watch Ragnar fall while attacking his own son during a peace ceremony, there's no ambiguity left." The council dispersed to begin preparations. Lucien stayed behind with Veilor, staring at the map showing the capital's defensive positions. "You know he's going to try to kill you personally," Veilor said. "Not just defeat you, not just discredit you. He's going to go for a killing blow because that's the only way he wins." "I know. And you're okay with that? With forcing a confrontation where one of you has to die?" Lucien looked at his old teacher. 20 years. That's how long you spent preparing me for moments exactly like this. Teaching me to survive when survival seemed impossible. Making me into something strong enough to face down the impossible and win. He turned back to the map. "So yes, I'm okay with it, because there's no other path forward. Either I end this rebellion by defeating my father, or he ends my reign by killing me. Those are the only 2 outcomes left." What happened to wanting to be different? To ruling with justice instead of just violence? That dream died the moment Ragnar chose rebellion over reconciliation. Lucien's voice went flat. "You can't compromise with someone who wants you dead. You can't build a better empire while fighting a civil war. So first I win. Then, if I survive, I figure out how to be the ruler my mother wanted me to be. And if the winning costs you what's left of your humanity, then at least the empire survives. That's all that matters now." Valor studied him with those unsettling violet eyes. You've changed. When you first came back, there was still anger in you, passion. Now there's just cold calculation. You made me this way. I made you strong. You chose to become cold. The accusation hung between them. Lucien wanted to deny it, but couldn't. Valor was right. Somewhere in the past 2 months of escalating violence and impossible choices, he'd stopped feeling things the way normal people did, stopped caring about anything except winning. The shadows had consumed more than just his enemies. They'd consumed the parts of him that used to feel guilt, empathy, hesitation. Is that bad? Lucien asked quietly. Being cold? Being focused only on survival? Depends on whether you ever find your way back. The announcement went out the next morning. King Lucien Nightvale would address the Empire in 2 weeks at the Grand Plaza. All citizens were invited. All clans were welcome to send representatives. It would be a demonstration of unity and strength, a celebration of the Empire's resilience in the face of internal threats. The propaganda was thick enough to choke on, but it served its purpose. Within hours, word spread across every territory. Within days, Lucien's spies reported frantic activity in the northern regions. Ragnar was mobilizing, calling in every favor, every alliance, every warrior who still believed in the old ways. He was taking the bait exactly as planned. Lucien spent those 2 weeks turning the capital into a fortress. Archers on every rooftop. Barricades at every major intersection. Elite warriors positioned in civilian clothes throughout the crowd. Shadow magic traps woven into the plaza itself. Invisible triggers that would activate the moment hostile forces entered the perimeter. It was the most elaborate ambush in the Empire's history. And if it failed, it would be Lucien's tomb. Sarah found him the night before the ceremony. He was on the palace ramparts staring at the city below. Lights flickered in thousands of windows, people going about their lives, unaware that tomorrow would determine whether those lives continued under his rule or descended into chaos under his father's. Couldn't sleep? Sarah asked. Sleep requires peace of mind. I haven't had that in months. She leaned against the wall beside him. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. Forcing this confrontation. The uncertainty was killing us faster than any battle would. Doesn't make it easier. Nothing about leadership is easy. If it was, everyone would do it. Lucien glanced at her. When did you become so wise? Sarah smiled slightly. Around the same time, I started working for a king who actually gives a damn about more than just his own power. You're not perfect, Lucien, but you're trying. That counts for something. Does it? Because I've killed hundreds of people in the past 2 months, ordered executions, destroyed families, all in the name of protecting the Empire. And how many thousands would die if you lost? If Ragnar retook the throne and went back to the old ways? Your reforms matter. The changes you're making matter. Don't lose sight of that just because the cost is high. She pushed off the wall. Get some sleep. Tomorrow you need to be sharp. Sarah left him alone with his thoughts and the city lights and the weight of tomorrow pressing down on his shoulders. He thought about his mother, about the last words she'd spoken asking him to survive, wondering if she'd consider what he'd become survival or just a different kind of death. The shadows wrapped around him like a familiar embrace, and Lucien realized with cold certainty that it didn't matter anymore. He'd gone too far down this path to turn back. Tomorrow he'd either emerge victorious or die trying, and both outcomes felt equally empty. That was the real cost no one talked about. Not the violence, not the difficult choices, but the slow erosion of caring about anything beyond the next battle, the next threat, the next crisis demanding everything you had left to give. Power didn't corrupt through temptation, it corrupted through exhaustion, wearing you down until you stopped fighting for ideals and just fought to survive one more day. Lucien went to bed but didn't sleep. Just lay there staring at the ceiling and counting the hours until dawn. Whack. The plaza filled early. Thousands of citizens packed the enormous square in front of the palace. Merchants, farmers, warriors, nobles. Everyone who could make the journey had come to witness their king address the Empire. Lucien watched from a palace window as they gathered. Every face was a life depending on him making the right choices. Every person in that crowd represented someone who'd suffer if he failed. The pressure should have been crushing. Instead, Lucien felt nothing but cold focus. General Kael appeared at his shoulder. We've got reports of large groups moving toward the city from the north, at least 3,000 fighters based on our scouts' estimates. Ragnar's army, Lucian said. Seems like it. They'll hit the perimeter right around noon if they maintain current speed. Perfect timing, right when I'll be most exposed on that platform. Kale smiled grimly. Your father always did have a sense of drama. Wonder where I got it from. Lucian turned from the window and headed for the grand hall where his armor waited. Not the ceremonial kind meant for show, real combat armor, reinforced with shadow-woven enchantments that would turn aside most blades and slow down even alpha claws. Valor helped him into it piece by piece, checking every strap and buckle with meticulous care. Remember what I taught you, the sorcerer said quietly. Shadow magic responds to emotion, but it's controlled by will. If you let the anger take over, the power becomes wild, dangerous to everyone, including yourself. I remember. Do you? Because you've been running on rage for months. I've watched it consume more of you every day. Then today it gets channeled into something useful. Violor grabbed his arm. Listen to me. Your father wants you angry, wants you emotional and reckless. That's when you make mistakes. That's when he can exploit an opening. Lucian met his eyes. I'm not that 17-year-old boy anymore. I'm not going to fall apart just because he shows up. I know you're not, but I also know that killing your own father, even one who betrayed you, leaves scars that never heal. Be ready for that. If I survive long enough to worry about scars, I'll consider it a victory. The armor settled on his shoulders like a second skin. Lucien looked at himself in the polished mirror and barely recognized the figure staring back. Black armor that seemed to absorb light. Shadows moving across the surface like living things. Eyes that had gone cold and predatory. He looked like a weapon given human form. Maybe that's all he was now. Sarah knocked and entered. It's time. The crowd's getting restless. Lucien nodded once and headed for the doors. His honor guard fell in around him, 20 elite warriors handpicked for their loyalty and skill. They'd fight to the death to protect him. He just hoped it wouldn't come to that. The walk to the plaza felt like walking to an execution, his own or someone else's. He wasn't sure yet. The crowd roared when he emerged onto the raised platform. Lucien raised one hand and the noise died instantly. The silence was almost worse than the cheering, thousands of people holding their breath, waiting to see what happened next. People of the Empire. Lucian's voice carried across the plaza, enhanced by the acoustics Valor had built into the platform. I stand before you today not just as your king, but as someone who understands what it means to be thrown away by the system, to be judged unworthy because of circumstances beyond your control. He let the words sink in, saw people nodding, remembering his story. 20 years ago, I was exiled from this very palace because I didn't awaken a wolf, cast into the wastelands to die. But I survived. And in surviving, I learned that true strength isn't something you're born with. It's something you forge through pain and determination and refusing to quit even when death would be easier. More nods. People were listening. I came back not for revenge, but because this empire needed someone who understood that our old ways were breaking us. That measuring worth by bloodline alone meant throwing away talented people who could have made us stronger. Movement at the edge of the plaza caught his eye. The crowd was stirring, shifting, making way for something pushing through from the north entrance. Lucian kept talking even as his heart rate spiked. But there are those who believe the old ways were better. Who think strength can only come from wolf blood? Who would rather see the empire burn than adapt to a changing world? The attack came faster than expected. Ragnar burst through the crowd already in full wolf form, massive and terrifying. Behind him, hundreds of true-blood warriors poured into the plaza from multiple entry points simultaneously. They'd been hiding in the crowd the whole time. Lucian's carefully prepared defenses activated instantly. Archers opened fire from the rooftops. His hidden warriors shed their civilian disguises and engaged. The shadow traps woven into the plaza flared to life, wrapping around dozens of attackers. But there were too many. Far more than the 3,000 his scouts had reported. Ragnar had sent a decoy force to draw attention while smuggling his real army into the city disguised as civilians. The old bastard had outplayed him again. Chaos consumed the plaza in seconds. Citizens screaming and running, warriors from both sides clashing in brutal close combat, blood splashing across ancient stones as people died by the dozens. And through it all, Ragnar came for Lucian like vengeance incarnate. The Alpha King's wolf form covered the distance in heartbeats. He crashed into Lucian's honor guard like a battering ram, scattering warriors with contemptuous ease. Claws opened throats, teeth crushed windpipes. Nothing could slow him down. Lucian let the shadows explode outward in a wave of pure darkness. They caught Ragnar mid-leap and slammed him into the platform hard enough to crack the reinforced wood. But the Alpha King shook it off and lunged again, this time managing to rake claws across Lucian's chest. The enchanted armor held, but the impact drove Lucian backward. He tasted blood where he'd bitten his tongue. Pain was clarifying, reminded him this was real, that he could actually die here. Good. Fear sharpened instincts. Lucien shaped the shadows into blades and sent them screaming toward his father. Ragnar dodged 3, but the 4th caught him across the ribs, drawing first blood. The Alpha King snarled and shifted back to human. Still hiding behind magic, Ragnar spat. Still too weak to face me as a real warrior. I don't need to be a warrior when I can be a storm. Lucien raised both hands and the shadows descended like a living avalanche. But Ragnar was already moving, faster than someone his age should be able to move. He grabbed a fallen warrior's spear and hurled it with alpha strength. The spear punched through Lucian's defenses and buried itself in his left shoulder. White-hot agony exploded through his body. Lucien stumbled, his concentration breaking for just a moment. That was all Ragnar needed. The Alpha King closed the distance and grabbed him by the throat, lifting Lucien off his feet. Ragnar's grip was iron, crushing. Lucien's vision started to gray at the edges. You had so much potential, Ragnar growled. Could have been great if you'd just accepted what you were, but you had to try to change everything, had to reject tradition, had to prove you were better than me. His grip tightened. Now you die knowing you failed, that your empire will crumble, that everything you built will be erased. Lucien couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, but he could still move his hands. He grabbed the spear still embedded in his shoulder and yanked it free with a scream that had no sound. Then he drove it straight through his father's chest. Ragnar's eyes went wide. His grip loosened. He staggered backward with the spear jutting from between his ribs. Should have killed me when you had the chance, Lucien rasped. His throat felt crushed, but he forced the words out. Should have made sure I was dead 20 years ago, instead of assuming the wastelands would do your work for you. Ragnar looked down at the spear. Blood was spreading across his chest in a dark stain. When he looked back up at Lucien, something had changed in his expression. The arrogance was gone. The certainty. What replaced it was something almost like regret. Maybe I should have, Ragnar admitted. His voice was weakening. Or maybe I should have been a better father. Should have seen past my own fear long enough to realize what I was throwing away. He dropped to his knees. Around them, the battle raged on, but it felt distant, unimportant. In this moment, there was only father and son, and the space between them filled with 20 years of pain. I'm sorry, Ragnar said, for all of it. For failing you. For choosing pride over love. For becoming so obsessed with tradition that I couldn't see I was destroying my own family. Lucien stood over him, his shoulder bleeding, his throat bruised, his entire body screaming in agony. Part of him wanted to finish it, to drive another blade through his father's heart and end this once and for all. But another part, the part that still remembered being 17 and desperate for his father's approval, couldn't quite make that final move. Why? Lucien asked. Why rebel? Why force this confrontation when you could have just stayed away? Ragnar smiled sadly. Because I'm exactly what you're becoming, a man who can't accept when he's lost, who keeps fighting even when fighting only makes things worse, who'd rather die than admit he was wrong. He coughed blood. You wanted to be different from me, but here we are. You standing over my dying body, me finally understanding what my pride cost us both. The words hit harder than any physical blow. Because Ragnar was right. In trying so hard not to become his father, Lucien had become exactly the same thing, a ruler who solved problems through violence, who couldn't compromise, who'd sacrificed everything human in himself for the sake of power and control. Father, Lucien started, but Ragnar was already falling. His body hit the platform and went still. The massive Alpha King, who'd ruled for 40 years through strength and fear, died, surrounded by the chaos he'd created, killed by the son he'd thrown away. Lucien stood there with blood dripping from his shoulder and his father's corpse at his feet, and felt absolutely nothing. No triumph, no grief, just hollow emptiness. Around them, the battle was turning. Ragnar's death had broken something in his warriors. They were surrendering or fleeing. Lucien's forces were winning, but victory tasted like ashes. General Kael appeared at his side, supporting him as his legs threatened to give out. "My king, you're injured. We need to get you to the healers." "In a minute," Lucien said. "First, I need to address the survivors." He forced himself to walk to the edge of the platform. The fighting had mostly stopped now. Both sides were staring at him, at their king standing over his dead father, covered in blood and shadows. "It's over," Lucien called out. His voice was rough, but it carried. "Your leader is dead. Your rebellion ends here. Anyone who surrenders now will face trial but live. Anyone who keeps fighting dies where they stand." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, slowly, weapons started hitting the ground. Ragnar's warriors knew when they were beaten. Lucien turned to his own forces. "Take them into custody. Treat them fairly." They were following orders from someone they believed in. That doesn't make them monsters. Sarah appeared with healers. They tried to examine his shoulder, but Lucien waved them off. Not yet. First, he had something else to do. He knelt beside his father's body and closed the dead eyes. Up close, Ragnar looked older than Lucien remembered. Tired. Like the weight of 40 years of ruling had finally caught up with him in death. "You were right about one thing," Lucien said quietly. "I did become like you, cold, ruthless, willing to sacrifice anything for power. And I hate that you were right." He stood up slowly. "But unlike you, I'm going to try to do better. Going to try to remember that ruling isn't just about winning, it's about what you do after the winning's done." The healers descended on him then, insisting he couldn't delay treatment any longer. Lucien let them work, barely feeling their hands as they cleaned and stitched the spear wound. His mind was somewhere else, somewhere dark and cold where he was finally confronting the truth he'd been avoiding for months. He'd won the war, defeated the rebellion, killed his father, and secured his throne. But in doing so, he'd lost something essential, some core part of himself that used to believe in ideals like justice and mercy and redemption. The question now was whether that part could ever be recovered, or if the price of victory had been too high to ever pay back. Valor found him hours later sitting alone in the throne room. The sorcerer looked older somehow, wearier. "You did it," Valor said. "You survived. You won." "Did I?" "Because it doesn't feel like winning. That's because you're finally understanding the real cost. Not the violence, not the death, but what you have to become to survive at the top." Lucien looked at his mentor. "Is this what you wanted? When you saved me in those wastelands 20 years ago? To create someone who could win but couldn't feel anything anymore? I wanted you to survive," Valor said quietly. "Whether that was worth it is something you'll spend the rest of your life deciding." He turned to leave but paused at the door. "For what it's worth, your mother would still be proud. Not of the killing, but of the fact that you're questioning it, that you still care enough to wonder if you've gone too far. And if I have, then you do what you've always done. You survive it, you adapt, you become something new." The sorcerer vanished into the shadows, leaving Lucien alone with his crown and his throne, and the crushing knowledge that he'd achieved everything he'd fought for while losing everything that mattered. Outside, the Empire celebrated. Their king had triumphed. The rebellion was crushed. Peace was restored. But Lucien sat in the gathering darkness and wondered if any of it had been worth the cost. If survival without humanity was really survival at all, or just a different kind of death that took decades to finish killing you. The shadows gathered closer, offering their familiar comfort. And for the first time in months, Lucien pushed them back. Because if there was any chance of finding his way back to being human, it had to start with rejecting the darkness that had sustained him through the impossible. Even if that rejection meant being vulnerable again, meant feeling the full weight of what he'd done and who he'd become. It was time to find out if the man could survive now that the weapon had won. Time to discover whether King Lucien Nightvale would become the tyrant his father feared or the leader his mother believed he could be. The throne room doors opened and Sarah walked in carrying reports that needed his immediate attention. The work of rebuilding never stopped. Crisis management, diplomatic complications, 1,000 details requiring decisions. Lucian looked at the stack of problems and felt something stir in his chest. Not quite hope. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of purpose beyond just survival. He stood up from the throne and met Sarah halfway. "Let's get to work," he said. "We've got an empire to rebuild, and this time we're doing it right." She smiled. It was a small thing, but it felt like dawn breaking after the longest night. And as they walked toward the council chambers together, Lucian allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst was finally over. That maybe he could find a way to honor both his parents' legacies, his father's strength and his mother's compassion. That maybe the Shadow King could learn to rule in the light. But that story would have to wait for tomorrow. Tonight, there was still a war to finish, still prisoners to process, still a father to bury with the honors he didn't deserve but would receive anyway, because that's what mercy looked like. Lucien took a breath, then another. The wound in his shoulder throbbed in time with his heartbeat, a reminder that he was still alive, still human enough to feel pain. And if he could still feel pain, maybe he could still feel everything else too. The shadows followed him down the corridor, but for the first time in months, they didn't lead. He did. The funeral procession stretched for miles. Lucien stood at the front beside his father's body, dressed in formal mourning armor that felt heavier than any battle gear he'd ever worn. Behind him, thousands followed. Nobles, warriors, citizens who'd lived under Ragnar's rule for 4 decades. Some wept openly. Others maintained stoic silence. All of them watched Lucien with eyes that asked the same question. What kind of king buries the father he killed? The kind who understands that mercy isn't weakness, Lucien thought. The kind who knows that showing respect to the dead might be the first step toward healing the living. They reached the royal burial grounds as the sun climbed toward noon, the same place where his mother lay beneath winter roses and marble. Now Ragnar would join her, returning to the earth that had sustained his empire for so long. Elder Morvain stepped forward to speak the traditional words, but his voice cracked halfway through. The old wolf had served 3 generations of Alpha Kings, and watching the bloodline tear itself apart had broken something fundamental in him. Lucian placed a hand on Morvain's shoulder. "Let me," he said quietly. The elder stepped back, relief and gratitude warring on his weathered face. Lucien turned to address the gathered crowd. His shoulders still ached where the spear had pierced it 3 days ago. The healers said it would scar. Good. He wanted the reminder of what this war had cost. "My father was not a perfect man," Lucian began. His voice carried across the cemetery, clear and steady despite the grief trying to choke him. He ruled through strength and fear. He valued tradition over compassion. He threw away his own son because pride mattered more than love. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the sanitized eulogy they'd expected, but he was also the man who built this empire from warring clans and constant bloodshed, who brought stability to territories that had known only chaos, who spent 40 years making impossible decisions that kept millions of people safe, even when those decisions cost him pieces of his own humanity. Lucian looked down at the body wrapped in ceremonial furs. Ragnar looked smaller in death, less terrifying. Just a tired old man who'd fought too long and lost too much. He made mistakes that wounded people for generations, made choices that destroyed families, including his own. But he also carried burdens none of us can fully understand. The weight of ruling, the constant pressure of knowing that every decision affects thousands of lives, the slow erosion of self that comes from being the person everyone depends on but nobody truly knows. His voice dropped lower, forcing people to lean in to hear. "I killed my father 3 days ago, drove a spear through his chest and watched him die. And I won't apologize for it because he gave me no choice. He chose rebellion over peace, violence over reconciliation, pride over family. The silence was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. But I will honor him. Because underneath the tyrant was a man who loved this empire enough to sacrifice everything for it, including his relationship with his son, including his own soul. And maybe, in his final moments, he understood that the strength he valued so highly had become the cage that trapped him." Lucian knelt and placed one hand on his father's chest. "I forgive you," he said quietly, "for all of it, for the exile, for the cruelty, for choosing your empire over your family, Because holding on to that anger would only turn me into another version of you, and I'm done repeating your mistakes. He stood and stepped back. Elder Morvain moved forward to complete the ceremony, his hands trembling as he scattered ritual herbs over the body. They lowered Ragnar into the earth beside Evelyn, husband and wife reunited in death after being separated by politics and pride in life. Lucien wondered if they were at peace now, wherever souls went when bodies failed. Wondered if his mother was telling his father all the ways he'd gotten things wrong while somehow still loving him anyway. The crowd began to disperse slowly. People approached to offer condolences or pledges of loyalty or carefully worded political statements. Lucien acknowledged each one with the minimal courtesy required, his mind already somewhere else. He waited until the cemetery emptied except for his closest people. Sarah stood a respectful distance away, giving him space. General Kael lingered near the gate, ever the guardian. Violor remained in the shadows between monuments, his violet eyes watching everything. Lucien walked to his mother's grave and knelt in the grass. The winter roses Sarah had been placing here weekly were fresh, their scent cut through the smell of turned earth and funeral herbs. "I won," he said to this carved stone bearing her name. "I defeated the rebellion, secured the throne, killed everyone who stood against me, just like you asked me to survive and protect the empire." The wind whispered through the trees. "But I don't think this is what you meant when you asked me to make things better. I don't think you wanted me to become so much the weapon that I forgot how to be human. To win so hard that I lost myself in the winning." His throat tightened. "I need to find a way back, Mother. Need to figure out how to rule without becoming another version of Father. But I don't know how. Don't know if it's even possible after everything I've done." A hand settled on his shoulder. Lucien looked up to find Veilor standing beside him, the sorcerer's ageless face showing something almost like gentleness. "She'd tell you that trying is what matters," Veilor said. "Not succeeding perfectly. Just trying every day to be a little more human than you were the day before." How would you know what she'd say? Because every parent wants their child to be better than they were, to learn from their mistakes instead of repeating them. Your mother saw something in you worth saving even when your father only saw a disappointment. That belief doesn't die just because she did. Lucien stood slowly. His legs ached, his shoulder throbbed. Every part of him felt like it had been through a war, which made sense because it had. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted. "Be the king they need. Build something better instead of just maintaining through fear." "Then learn," Veilor said. "Surround yourself with people who remember your humanity when you forget it. Listen to perspectives that challenge yours. Make mistakes and acknowledge them instead of doubling down. It's not complicated, it's just hard." The sorcerer's expression turned serious. "And it starts with a choice. Right now. Today. Do you want to be the Shadow King who rules through power and terror? Or do you want to be something new? Something that might actually deserve the crown your mother believed you should wear?" Lucien looked at his parents' graves. Two people who'd shaped him in fundamentally different ways. One taught him strength, the other taught him compassion. Maybe the answer wasn't choosing between them, but finding a way to honor both. He turned to Veilor. "I want to try. Don't know if I'll succeed, but I want to try." "Good," Veilor said. "Then let's get to work. You've got an empire to rebuild and only about 40 years if you're lucky to figure out how." The real work started the next morning. Lucien convened an expanded council that included not just nobles and military commanders, but representatives from common citizens, merchant guilds, farming collectives. People who'd never had direct access to power before suddenly found themselves sitting at tables where decisions were made. The traditional nobles hated it. Lord Heron looked like he'd swallowed something sour when a farmer from the Western Territories questioned military spending priorities. "With respect," Lord Heron said through gritted teeth, "matters of imperial defense are complex, perhaps better left to those with appropriate expertise." The farmer, a weathered woman named Mara, who'd lost 2 sons in Ragnar's wars, didn't back down. "With respect, my lord, I've watched my boys die for imperial defense. Think that gives me the right to question how you're spending the taxes I pay." Lucien watched the exchange with something approaching satisfaction. This was what change looked like, uncomfortable, messy, full of people challenging each other's assumptions. "Lady Mara makes a valid point," he said. The military exists to protect citizens. Those citizens deserve input on how protection is prioritized. Lord Heron looked like he wanted to argue, but wisely kept silent. They spent 6 hours that day working through a backlog of issues that had accumulated during the war. Food distribution systems, reconstruction funding, treatment of captured rebels. Each decision required balancing competing interests, managing egos, finding compromises that left nobody completely happy but everyone functional. Leadership, Lucien was learning, was 90% negotiation and 10% making unpopular choices stick. By the time the council adjourned, he was exhausted, but it was a different kind of tired than battle fatigue. This was the weariness that came from actually thinking about problems instead of just destroying them. Sarah found him in his private study afterward. She carried a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "Thought you might need this," she said. "Is it that obvious? You spent 6 hours listening to people argue about grain subsidies without killing anyone. That deserves celebration." Lucien accepted a glass and drank deeply. The wine was good, probably from his father's private collection. It tasted like expensive grapes and complicated history. "Did I make the right call?" Lucien asked, opening the council to common representatives. Sarah considered the question. "You made a call that aligns with your values. Whether it's right depends on whether those values can actually function in reality. Ask me again in 6 months." Ever the optimist, ever the realist. She settled into the chair across from him. "You're trying to reshape an empire that's operated one way for 50 generations. That doesn't happen overnight. There will be resistance, failures, moments where you question everything. Encouraging." But Sarah continued, "There will also be successes. Small victories where the new approach works better than the old one. People who thrive under a system that values ability over bloodline. Families that stay intact because their children aren't thrown away for being different." She met his eyes. "You asked earlier if you could do this. Be the king they need. The answer is maybe, but that maybe is better than the certainty of what your father offered, which was strength without mercy and tradition without growth." Lucien swirled the wine in his glass. "When did you become my advisor on philosophy instead of just logistics?" "Around the time you started actually needing philosophical advice instead of just efficient supply chains." "Fair point." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. The study was one of the few rooms in the palace Lucien actually liked. Small enough to feel intimate, filled with books instead of weapons, windows that looked out over gardens rather than battlefields. "Can I ask you something personal?" Sarah said finally. "Depends on the question. Do you regret it? Killing your father?" Lucien thought about the moment the spear had punched through Ragnar's chest, the look in his father's eyes as he died, the hollow victory that came from winning a war against your own blood. "No," he said slowly. "I regret that it was necessary. Regret that he couldn't let go of the past long enough to see we could build something better together. But the actual act of killing him? No. He made his choice and I made mine. That's remarkably clear-headed. I've had time to process. 20 years of exile teaches you that holding on to anger only poisons yourself. Doesn't change what happened. Doesn't make the other person sorry. Just slowly destroys you from the inside. Sounds like something Valor would say. Valor says a lot of things. Some of them are even helpful." Sarah smiled and stood. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow you've got a delegation from the Eastern clans arriving. They want to discuss the new governance model." "Of course they do." Lucien set down his glass. Because one day of restructuring the entire imperial system wasn't enough. "Welcome to leadership. The work never stops." She left him alone with his thoughts and the ghosts that still haunted quiet moments. Lucien moved to the window and looked out over the capital. Lights flickered in thousands of homes, people living their lives, loving, fighting, surviving. Most of them would never know his name or care about the politics that shaped their world. They just wanted safety and opportunity and the chance to build something for their children. That's what he needed to focus on. Not grand gestures or dramatic reforms, but the grinding day-to-day work of making the empire function better for the people who actually lived in it. The shadows stirred at the edge of his vision. They still responded to his emotions, still offered their dark comfort, but Lucien pushed them back gently. He didn't need that kind of power anymore. Didn't need the shadows to make him strong or feared or effective. What he needed was the courage to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, to trust other people instead of relying only on himself. That was a different kind of strength, one his father had never understood, one Lucien was determined to master, even if it took the rest of his life. Teak. 3 months passed in a blur of council meetings and policy reforms and careful political maneuvering. Lucien established tribunals to hear grievances from citizens who'd been wronged under the old system. He created educational programs so children without wolves could learn trades and professions previously reserved for nobility. He restructured military recruitment to value skill over bloodline, opening positions to anyone who could meet the standards. Every change faced resistance. Every reform had unintended consequences that required adjustment. But slowly, painfully slowly, the empire began to shift. Not everyone approved. A faction of traditional nobles petitioned for his abdication, claiming he was destroying their heritage. Lucien listened to their concerns, acknowledged their fears, and then explained that heritage wasn't worth preserving if it required throwing away talented people. They left angry, but without staging a rebellion. Progress. General Kyle reported that morale among the troops was improving. Soldiers who'd previously felt trapped by their birth status were thriving now that advancement depended on merit. The military was actually getting stronger under the new system. More progress. Sarah's logistics reforms were cutting waste and improving resource distribution. Fewer shortages. Better infrastructure, that's right. Citizens in remote territories were seeing investment from the capital for the first time in generations. Still more progress. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close to perfect, but it was movement in the right direction. Veilor found Lucien on the palace ramparts one evening. The sorcerer had been absent for weeks, traveling to distant territories to check on something he wouldn't explain. "You've changed," Veilor observed. Lucien glanced at him. "Good or bad?" "Neither. Just different, less angry, less desperate to prove something. I don't have anything left to prove. I won, survived, became king. Now I'm just trying to do the job without becoming a monster." Veilor leaned against the stone wall. "You know what the truly remarkable part is? You're actually succeeding. The empire is stabilizing. People are adapting. You're building something that might actually outlast you. Don't sound so surprised." "I'm not surprised. I'm impressed. When I pulled you out of those wastelands 20 years ago, I thought I was saving a boy who'd become a weapon. Turns out I saved someone who could become a weapon when necessary, but chose to be a builder instead." The sorcerer's expression turned serious. "I'm leaving soon, heading east to territories I haven't visited in decades. Won't be back for a while." Lucien felt something twist in his chest. After 20 years of constant presence, the thought of Veilor leaving felt wrong. "You're just walking away? I'm letting you walk forward without me. There's a difference. You don't need a teacher anymore. You need space to become your own kind of leader. What if I fail? Then you pick yourself up and try differently. That's what growth looks like." Veilor placed a hand on Lucien's shoulder. "You survived the wastelands, survived 20 years of brutal training, survived a war against your own father. You'll survive being a king too." He stepped back. "Make your mother proud. That's all that matters now." Then he was gone, disappearing into shadows the way he'd done countless times before. But this time felt final, like a chapter closing. Lucien stood alone on the ramparts and felt the weight of solitude settle over him. For 20 years, Veilor had been there, teaching, challenging, pushing him to survive when survival seemed impossible. Now he was truly on his own. The shadows whispered at the edge of his consciousness, offering familiar comfort. But Lucien let them fade. He didn't need their strength anymore. He had his own. The anniversary of his coronation arrived with fanfare Lucien didn't want but tolerated because symbolism mattered to people. The palace hosted a grand celebration. Music, dancing, elaborate feasts that showcased the empire's recovered prosperity. Nobles mixed with commoners in ways that would have scandalized previous generations. Lucien watched from the throne and tried to appreciate what the celebration represented. 1 year of his rule, 1 year of relative peace and gradual improvement, 1 year of proving that maybe, just maybe, The wolfless king could actually lead. Sarah appeared at his side. You're brooding on what's supposed to be a happy occasion. Just thinking about how much has changed. Good changes or bad changes? Both. The Empire's better in a lot of ways, more fair, more inclusive, but it's also more complicated, more challenging to manage, harder to predict. Welcome to progress, Sarah said. It's messy and uncomfortable and infinitely better than stagnation. A commotion at the entrance drew their attention. A messenger pushed through the crowd, mud-splattered and exhausted. He made directly for the throne and knelt. My king, urgent news from the Northern Territories. Lucien's body went tense. What now? The messenger looked up with an expression caught between fear and wonder. We've discovered something in the wastelands, something impossible. Explain. A settlement. Hidden deep in the cursed territories where nobody goes. It's populated by exiles, people who were thrown away over the years for various reasons. They've built an entire community out there. The messenger took a breath. And they're asking for your protection. They want to formally petition for inclusion in the Empire. They've heard about your reforms and want to be part of what you're building. Lucien felt the world tilt slightly. All those years he'd spent in the wastelands, he'd assumed he was the only one, that he was unique in his suffering. But apparently there had been others, dozens or maybe hundreds of people discarded by the system, surviving in the margins, building lives out of scraps and determination. People exactly like him. How many? He asked. At least 300 based on initial counts, maybe more. They've been there for generations. Some were born in exile. 300 lives that could have enriched the Empire if they'd been valued instead of thrown away. 300 stories of survival that mirrored his own. Lucien stood from the throne. The celebration continued around him, but he'd stopped hearing it. Prepare an expedition, he told Sarah. I'm going to the wastelands personally. My king, that's not... I'm going, Lucien interrupted. These are my people. If anyone understands what they've survived, it's me. And if we're going to integrate them into the Empire, I need to see how they've built their community. General Kael appeared, ever the protector. Then I'm going with you, along with a full security detail. Fine. We leave in 3 days. That gives us time to prepare properly. He turned back to the messenger. Tell them we're coming. Tell them the king himself wants to meet them. And tell them... Lucien paused, choosing his words carefully. Tell them that being thrown away doesn't define their worth. That surviving the impossible makes them exactly the kind of people this empire needs. That they're not broken or defective or less than. They're just different. And different is going to be valued from now on. The messenger nodded and departed. The celebration resumed. But Lucien's mind was already in the wastelands, imagining what he'd find there. A community built by the discarded. People who'd taken the cruelty of exile and transformed it into something functional. Maybe even beautiful. It was exactly the kind of story the Empire needed to hear. Exactly the kind of validation that his reforms were based on truth instead of just ideology. Sarah touched his arm gently. You're thinking this changes everything, doesn't it? Proof that the system was throwing away valuable people. Proof that survival and strength can come from places traditional power never acknowledged. It's powerful symbolism. But be careful. The nobles who resist your reforms will find ways to minimize this. To claim these exiles are exceptions rather than examples. Then we make sure the truth is impossible to ignore, Lucien said. We integrate this community fully. Give them representation. Show the entire empire what these people have built from nothing. He looked out over the celebration. All these people dancing and drinking and celebrating under a system that was slowly becoming more just, more fair, more human. This is what Mother wanted, he said quietly. Not the throne or the crown or the power. Just a world where people weren't destroyed for being different. Where survival wasn't reserved for those lucky enough to be born into the right bloodline. Sarah smiled. Then we keep building it, one reform at a time, one community at a time, until the entire empire reflects those values. The journey to the wastelands took 5 days. Lucien rode at the head of a small company, General Kael, 20 guards, Sarah, and a handful of administrators who'd help assess integration logistics. They followed the same path he'd stumbled down 20 years ago as a broken 17-year-old with no wolf and no future. The memories came flooding back. The cold that had nearly killed him. The desperation. The moment Valor had appeared offering a choice between death and transformation. Everything had changed since that night. But the wastelands looked exactly the same: twisted trees, frozen ground, shadows that moved wrong. They found the settlement on the sixth day. It was hidden in a valley protected by natural rock formations that blocked the worst winds. Someone had worked for years to make this place livable. Crude buildings but sturdy, gardens that somehow grew despite the cursed soil, a central gathering space with a fire pit that looked well used. 300 people emerged as Lucien's company approached. They looked wary, hopeful, terrified. Every emotion that came from risking everything on a single desperate gamble. Lucien dismounted and walked forward alone despite General Kael's protests. An older woman stepped forward from the crowd. She had scars across her face and arms, gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, eyes that had seen too much suffering. "You're him," she said. It wasn't a question. "The king who survived, the one without a wolf." "I am," Lucien confirmed. "And you are?" "Kessa. I've been leading this community for 15 years. Before that we had a council, but it fell apart. Needed someone willing to make hard decisions." Lucien smiled slightly. "I understand that feeling." He looked past her at the assembled people. So many faces marked by hardship. So many stories of surviving what should have killed them. "I came to hear your petition personally," Lucien said, "to understand what you've built here and what you need from the Empire." Kessa gestured toward the settlement. "Then come see. Judge for yourself if we're worth integrating." They spent hours touring the community. Lucien saw workshops where exiled craftspeople created beautiful work with limited tools, gardens where farmers coaxed growth from hostile soil through sheer stubborn determination, a small school where children learned reading and basic trades from whatever adults had relevant knowledge. It was rough, crude, barely functional. It was also the most beautiful thing Lucien had seen in months, because every aspect of this place screamed survival, adaptation, people taking the cruelty of exile and building community out of shared suffering. That evening, the settlement held a gathering in the central space. People sat around the fire while Kessa formally presented their petition. "We don't ask for charity," she said. "We ask for recognition, for the chance to contribute to the empire that threw us away. We've heard about your reforms, about making space for people like us. We want to be part of that." She paused. "We've survived the wastelands, survived each other, survived every reason to give up. If you give us the chance, we'll show the Empire that strength comes in forms they never imagined." Lucien stood and moved closer to the fire. Its warmth cut through the cold in ways that felt almost metaphorical. "I was 17 when they threw me into these wastelands," he said. 17 and broken and convinced I was worthless because I didn't manifest a wolf. I nearly died that first night. Would have if someone hadn't found me and offered a choice. He looked around at the assembled faces. All of you made similar choices. To survive when dying would have been easier. To build when destruction was the default. To create community when isolation was the path of least resistance. His voice strengthened. The Empire needs that kind of strength, not the traditional kind that comes from birthright and bloodline, but the kind you forge through pain and determination and refusing to quit. He turned to Kessa. "Your petition is granted. Effective immediately. We'll work out the logistics of integration, housing, employment, education for your children. But the core decision is made. You're part of the Empire now. Full citizens with all the rights and protections that entails." The silence that followed was profound. Then someone in the crowd started crying. Then someone else. Within moments, half the settlement was weeping. 20 years of fear and uncertainty finally releasing. Kessa gripped Lucien's hand hard enough to hurt. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means." "I think I do," Lucien said, "because I've been where you are. I know exactly what it means to be thrown away and then given a second chance." The integration process took months. Families from the wasteland settlement relocated to the capital and surrounding territories. They brought skills the Empire desperately needed. Unique craftsmanship techniques developed in isolation, agricultural methods adapted to hostile conditions, problem-solving approaches born from constant scarcity. The traditional nobles complained about resources being diverted to former exiles. Lucien listened to their concerns and then allocated more resources anyway, because this was the heart of everything he was trying to build. proving that the Empire's old habit of discarding people was wasteful and cruel. Demonstrating that value came from contribution, not bloodline. Kessa became an informal advisor, offering perspective from someone who'd actually lived through the worst the system could inflict. Her insights were brutal and necessary. You can't just give people housing and expect problems to solve themselves, she told Lucien during one planning session. These folks have trauma, years of it. They need counseling, support systems, time to adjust to not being in survival mode every minute. Sarah added that to the integration plan. It ballooned the budget, but Lucien approved it without hesitation. One morning, 6 months after the Wasteland expedition, Lucien stood on the palace balcony watching the capital wake up. Down in the streets, he could see former exiles working alongside native citizens, a wasteland craftsman teaching his techniques to guild apprentices, a woman from the settlement helping in a merchant shop, children playing together without caring about their parents' histories. It was working, slowly, imperfectly, but working. Sarah joined him, carrying the ever-present stack of documents needing his attention. "You look contemplative," she observed, "just thinking about how far we've come. How much has changed? Feeling satisfied?" Lucien considered the question. Not satisfied. Satisfaction implies completion. But I feel like we're moving in the right direction, like the work matters. That's probably the best any leader can hope for. She handed him the documents. "Speaking of work, we've got petitions from 3 more hidden communities. Apparently word spread about the integration. Everyone who was thrown away is coming out of the shadows." Lucien took the papers and felt something like joy spark in his chest. "Good. Let them come. We'll find a way to accommodate everyone. The Treasury is going to scream. The Treasury can handle it. We're not throwing people away anymore. Whatever it costs, we pay it." So, 2 years into his reign, Lucien returned to his mother's grave. The gardens around the royal burial ground had been expanded and beautified. Someone, probably Sarah, had made sure fresh flowers appeared weekly. Winter roses in the cold months, spring blooms when the weather warmed. Lucien knelt in the grass between his parents' graves and felt the weight of everything that had happened settle over him. "I kept my promise," he said to his mother's headstone. "The Empire survived. It's changing, becoming something better than what Father built." He glanced at Ragnar's grave. "And I forgave him. Don't know if he deserved it, but I did it anyway because holding on to that anger was destroying me." The wind whispered through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, birds sang. "I'm not perfect," Lucien continued. "Still make mistakes. Still struggle with the shadows sometimes. Still use fear when I should use patience. But I'm trying. Every day I'm trying to be the person you believed I could become." He stood slowly. His knees ached. His shoulders still gave him trouble when the weather changed. The scars from his battles, physical and psychological, would never fully heal. But that was okay. Scars were evidence of survival, proof that you'd faced something terrible and lived to tell about it. "Thank you," he said to both graves, "for everything. The good and the bad, the love and the cruelty. All of it made me who I am. All of it taught me what kind of leader I want to be." He turned and walked away from the past, back toward the palace where the future waited with its endless demands and impossible choices. Back toward the work of building something worth the cost of everything he'd survived. 5 years into his reign, the Empire held its first open assembly. Representatives from every territory gathered in the capital, nobles and commoners, warriors and farmers, craftspeople and scholars. For 3 days they debated policies, proposed reforms, challenged existing systems. It was chaotic, messy, completely unprecedented. It was also the most effective governance mechanism the Empire had ever implemented. Lucien watched from a raised platform as people who would never have had voices under the old system argued passionately about resource distribution and military priorities and educational access. He intervened only when debates became circular or when his authority was needed to break deadlocks. On the final day, they presented him with a document they'd collectively drafted, a charter of rights and responsibilities that formalized many of the reforms he'd implemented and proposed new ones he hadn't considered. It was brilliant, thoughtful, exactly the kind of collaborative governance he'd hoped to achieve. "This is remarkable," Lucien said, reading through the provisions. "You've built a framework that balances individual freedom with collective responsibility. That protects the vulnerable while rewarding contribution." Kessa stepped forward from the assembly. We learned from watching you, my king. You showed us that leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about creating space for people to find answers together. Lucian signed the charter with a pen that had belonged to his mother. The assembled representatives erupted in applause. And in that moment, Lucien finally felt something he hadn't experienced since before his exile. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, not the stillness that came from fear or exhaustion, but the deep abiding peace of knowing you were doing meaningful work, of building something that would outlast you, of honoring the sacrifices of those who came before by creating something better for those who came after. 10 years into his reign, Lucian stood on the palace balcony and watched the sun set over an empire transformed. The changes were everywhere if you knew where to look. Schools that accepted all children regardless of bloodline, governance councils that included common voices, economic systems that rewarded merit over inheritance, military structures that valued skill over wolf status. It wasn't perfect. There were still inequalities, still resistance from those who preferred the old ways, still problems that seemed insurmountable. But the empire was better, demonstrably, measurably better. Sarah found him as the last light faded from the sky. She'd aged well, gray threading through her dark hair, laugh lines around her eyes, the confident bearing of someone who'd helped rebuild a civilization. "Penny, for your thoughts," she said, "just reflecting on everything that's changed. Feeling nostalgic?" Lucian smiled. "Maybe a little. 10 years ago, I was fighting a civil war and wondering if I'd survive the week. Now I'm watching an empire thrive under systems I helped create. It's disorienting. You've earned the right to feel proud." "Have I? I killed my father, destroyed hundreds of lives, became the exact kind of ruthless operator I swore I wouldn't be." Sarah moved to stand beside him. "You became what was necessary to survive an impossible situation. Then you chose to become something better once survival was secure. That's not hypocrisy. That's growth." She gestured at the city below. "Look at what you've built. Not just infrastructure or policies, but actual change in how people think about worth and value and contribution. You took an empire built on cruelty and reshaped it into something that gives people hope. Hope's a dangerous thing to promise. Only if you don't deliver. And you have. Consistently. For a decade." Lucien looked at her. "When did you become my conscience?" "Around the same time you became more than just a king trying to prove something. Around the time you became a leader actually worth following." They stood in comfortable silence as night settled over the capital. Lights began flickering in windows across the city. Each one represented lives being lived, dreams being pursued, futures being built. All of it made possible because a broken prince had survived the wastelands and chosen to become something more than his trauma. "I'm tired," Lucian admitted. 10 years of constant vigilance, constant decision-making, constant pressure. "I'm tired." "Then rest. Take time for yourself. The empire won't collapse if you're not personally managing every detail." "Won't it?" "No. Because you've built systems that function without you. Trained people who can lead in your absence. Created institutions stronger than any individual. That's the real measure of successful leadership." Lucian considered that. The idea of stepping back, of trusting the structures he'd created. It was terrifying. It was also necessary. "I'll think about it," he said. "Don't think too long. You're not immortal despite what the shadows might have made you believe." 15 years into his reign, Lucian made a decision that shocked the empire. He announced a succession plan. Not because he was dying or abdicating, but because he wanted to ensure the empire wouldn't collapse when he eventually did die. He established a council that would govern during transitions, created selection criteria for future leaders based on merit and popular support rather than bloodline. He formalized the end of hereditary monarchy. The traditional nobles were apoplectic. This went against centuries of tradition, against everything the empire had been built upon. Lucien listened to their objections and then explained his reasoning in terms even the most resistant could understand. "Hereditary power created my father," he said during the public announcement. "Created a system where accidents of birth determined who led and who served. That system threw away talented people, elevated incompetent ones, led to the civil war that nearly destroyed us. He looked around the assembled crowd. I won't perpetuate that cycle. When I'm gone, leadership will pass to whoever can best serve the empire, not whoever happened to be born into the right family. But who decides? Someone shouted. How do we prevent chaos? The same way we prevent it now, Lucian answered, through councils, through debate, through systems that balance competing interests and find consensus. It won't be perfect, but it will be better than what came before. The policy passed despite significant opposition, because by that point, Lucian had built enough support among common citizens and progressive nobles that traditional resistance couldn't block major reforms. Sarah found him afterward looking exhausted but satisfied. That was a hell of a move, she said. Necessary one. I won't have my death trigger another succession crisis. Won't watch this empire tear itself apart again because someone thinks bloodline matters more than competence. Your father would have hated this. Good. Let him roll in his grave. Maybe he'll finally understand what his obsession with tradition cost everyone. 20 years into his reign, Lucian did something he'd never done before. He took a vacation. Just a week. Traveling to the coastal territories with minimal security and no official duties. Walking beaches. Visiting small towns. Talking to citizens who had no idea their king was the tired-looking man asking about their fishing techniques. It was the most peaceful week of his life. On the last day, he sat on a cliff overlooking the ocean and watched waves crash against rocks. The water was relentless, eternal, completely indifferent to human concerns about power and legacy and meaning. It was comforting in a strange way. A figure settled beside him. Lucian didn't need to look to know who it was. He'd felt Valor's presence approaching from a mile away. You came back, Lucian said. I told you I'd check on you eventually. Wanted to see if you'd become a tyrant or actually figured out how to lead. And your verdict? Valor gazed out at the ocean. You've exceeded every expectation I had, built something genuinely new, changed an empire that seemed unchangeable, and somehow managed to stay human in the process. Barely. Barely counts. The sorcerer smiled slightly. Your mother would be proud. Hell, even your father would be proud, though he'd never admit it. I killed him. You gave him what he forced you to give. Death was his choice as much as yours. They sat in silence for a while. 20 years had passed since Valor pulled a broken boy from the wastelands. 20 years of transformation and trauma and growth. Thank you, Lucian said finally, for saving me, for teaching me, for not giving up when I was at my worst. You did the hard part. I just pointed you in useful directions. Still, without you, I'd have died in those wastelands. Valor stood and brushed sand from his robes. Without you, I'd have spent the last 40 years bitter and alone, convinced the world was beyond saving. You reminded me that people can change, that systems can evolve, that hope isn't just naive optimism. He looked down at Lucian with something almost like affection. Keep building, keep adapting, keep proving that survival can transform into something beautiful, given enough time and effort. Then he walked away down the beach, his silver hair catching the sunlight. Lucian watched him go and felt the circle closing. Teacher and student, savior and saved, two damaged people who'd somehow helped each other become something better. Lucian stood and turned back toward the capital. His vacation was over. The empire waited with its endless demands. But for the first time in 20 years, those demands didn't feel like burdens. They felt like purpose. 25 years into his reign, King Lucian Nightvale stood before a new generation of leaders. Young people who'd grown up under his reforms, who'd never known an empire that threw away children for being different, who measured worth by contribution instead of bloodline. They looked at him with respect but not fear, with gratitude but not worship. It was exactly what he'd wanted. You inherit an empire transformed, Lucian told them during the Leadership Academy graduation. Not perfect. Far from it. But better than it was. More just. More inclusive. More willing to adapt. He paused. Your generation will face challenges I can't predict, threats I can't prepare you for. But you have something my generation didn't. The knowledge that strength comes in many forms, that diversity makes us stronger, that throwing people away is wasteful and cruel. Build on what we've started. Fix what we got wrong. Create systems we never imagined. Make this empire something your children will be proud to inherit." The graduates stood and applauded. Lucien accepted their tribute with grace and humility. Then he walked away from the podium and out into the gardens where his mother was buried. The grave was well maintained, always fresh flowers, the marble polished and clean. Lucien knelt in the grass and placed his hand on the stone. "I did it," he said quietly. "Survived. Changed the empire. Built something worth the cost of everything we went through." The wind rustled through the trees. His mother didn't answer because the dead never did. But Lucien felt her presence anyway. In the reformed systems, in the children who grew up valued instead of discarded. In the empire that finally understood strength came in forms the old ways never acknowledged. "Thank you for believing in me," he said, "even when I didn't deserve it, even when I became something dark and terrible. You never stopped hoping I'd find my way back." He stood slowly. His joints ached. Gray threaded through his hair. The years had marked him in ways beyond just physical aging, but he was still here, still fighting, still building, still proving that the boy thrown into the wastelands had been worth saving after all. Lucien walked back toward the palace as the sun set behind him. Shadows stretched long across the gardens, but they didn't frighten him anymore. He'd learned to walk in darkness without becoming it. And that, more than any crown or title or empire, was the real victory. The real proof that survival could transform into something beautiful. That broken things could heal if given time and care and the courage to become something new. King Lucien Nightvale climbed the palace steps and returned to the work that would define him long after death. Building, adapting, proving every day that the strength to change was greater than the power to destroy. It was enough. It had always been enough.